Candide by Voltaire, read by Jack Davenport. Candide, or optimism, translated from the German of Dr. Ralph, together with the addenda which were found in the doctor's pocket when he died at Minden in the year of grace 1759. Chapter 1. How Candide was brought up in a beautiful castle, and how he was kicked out of the same. Once upon a time, in Westphalia, in the castle of Baron Thunder ten Tronckh, there lived a young boy whom nature had endowed with the gentlest of dispositions. His soul was written upon his countenance. He was quite sound in his judgment, and he had the most straightforward of minds. It is for this reason, I believe, that he was called Candide. The older servants of the household suspected that he was the son of the Baron's sister by a kind and upright gentleman of the neighbourhood, a man whom this lady had consistently refused to marry because he had only ever been able to establish 71 heraldic quarterings, the rest of his family tree having been destroyed by the ravages of time. The Baron was one of the most powerful noblemen in Westphalia, for his castle had a door and windows. His great hall was even adorned with a tapestry. All the dogs in his farmyard would combine when the need arose to make up a pack of hounds. His grooms were his whippers-in, and the local vicar his great almoner. They all called him Your Lordship, and laughed at his jokes. The Baroness, who weighed approximately 350 pounds, therefore enjoyed a large measure of public esteem, and she performed the honours of the house with a degree of dignified aplomb that rendered her all the more respectable. Her daughter, Cunegonde, being 17 and of a high complexion, looked fresh, chubby, and toothsome. The Baron's son seemed in every way worthy of his father. Pangloss, the tutor, was the oracle of the household, and little Candide would listen to his lessons with all the good faith of his age and character. Pangloss taught metaphysico-theologico-cosmocadology. He could prove wonderfully that there is no effect without cause, and that in this best of all possible worlds, his lordship the Baron's castle was the most beautiful of castles, and Madam the best of all possible baronesses. "It is demonstrably true," he would say, "that things cannot be other than as they are. For, everything having been made for a purpose, everything is necessarily for the best purpose. Observe how noses were made to bear spectacles, and so we have spectacles. Legs are evidently devised to be clad in breeches, and breeches we have. Stones were formed in such a way that they can be hewn and made into castles, and so his lordship has a very beautiful castle. The greatest baron in the province must be the best lodged. And since pigs were made to be eaten, we eat pork all the year round. Consequently, those who have argued that all is well have been talking nonsense. They should have said that all is for the best." Candide would listen attentively, and innocently he would believe, for he found Miss Cunegonde extremely beautiful, though he had never made bold to tell her so. His conclusion was that next to the happiness of being born Baron Thunder ten Tronckh, the second degree of happiness was being Miss Cunegonde, the third was seeing her every day, and the fourth was listening to Maître Pangloss, the greatest philosopher in the province, and therefore in the whole world. One day, as Cunegonde was taking a stroll near the castle in the little wood they referred to as their parkland, she caught a glimpse through the bushes of Dr. Pangloss giving a lesson in applied physiology to her mother's maid, a very pretty and very receptive little brunette. As Miss Cunegonde had quite a gift for science, she noted in breathless silence the repeated experiments to which she was witness. She saw clearly the doctor's sufficient reason, the effects and the causes, and returned home all agitated, her thoughts provoked, and filled with a desire to be a scientist, musing that she might well be able to be young Candide's sufficient reason, just as he could well be hers. She met Candide on her return to the castle and blushed. Candide blushed too. She greeted him in a choked voice, and Candide spoke to her without knowing what he was saying. The next day after dinner, as they were leaving the table, Cunegonde and Candide found themselves behind a screen. Cunegonde dropped her handkerchief. Candide picked it up. Innocently she took his hand. Innocently the young man kissed the young lady's hand, and with quite singular vivacity, sensibility and grace. Their mouths met, their eyes shone, their knees trembled, their hands strayed. Baron Thunder Ten Tronckh passed by the screen, and seeing this cause and this effect, chased Candide out of the castle with a number of hefty kicks up the backside. Cunegonde fainted. As soon as she recovered her senses, the Baroness slapped her. And all was consternation in the most beautiful and most agreeable of all possible castles. Chapter 2. What became of Candide among the Bulgars? Candide, thus expelled from paradise on earth, walked on for a long time, not knowing where he was going, weeping, raising his eyes to heaven, and turning them often in the direction of the most beautiful of castles, which contained the most beautiful of barons' daughters. He went to sleep in the middle of the fields, supperless, in a furrow. The snow fell in large flakes. Next day, soaked to the skin, Candide dragged himself as far as the neighbouring town, which was called Volbergorf Traub Dickdorf. He had no money, and he was dying of hunger and exhaustion. He stopped wistfully at the door of a small hostelry. Two men dressed in blue spotted him. "Comrade," said one, "there's a fine figure of a young man, and he's the right height." They went up to Candide and very civilly invited him to dine with them. "Gentlemen," said Candide with charming modesty, "you do me great honour, but I have not the means to pay my corner." "Oh, sir," replied one of the men in blue, "people of your looks and quality never pay. Are you not 5 feet 5 inches tall?" "Yes, gentlemen, that is my height," he said with a bow. "Oh, sir, come, do sit yourself down at the table. Not only will we pay for you, but we will not see a man such as yourself go short either. Man was made that he might help his fellow man." "You are right," said Candide. "That's what Mr. Pangloss always told me, and I can see that everything is for the best." They pressed him to accept a few crowns. He took them and wanted to make out a receipt. It was not required. They all sat down at the table. "Don't you love—" "Oh, yes," he replied, "I love Miss Cunegonde." "No," said one of the gentlemen. "What we want to know is whether you love the King of the Bulgars or not." "Not in the least," he said, "for I have never met him." "What? He's the most charming of kings, and we must drink to his health." "Oh, very willingly, gentlemen." And he drank. "That'll do nicely," he was told. "That makes you a supporter, a defender, a champion, nay, a hero of the Bulgars. Your fortune is made and your glory assured." His feet were promptly clapped in irons, and he was taken off to the regiment. They made him do right turns, left turns, draw ramrods, replace ramrods, take aim, fire, quick march, and then they gave him 30 strokes of the birch. Next day he performed the drill a little less badly, and he received only 20. The next day they gave him only 10, and his comrades thought him a prodigy. Candide, totally bewildered, could not yet quite make out how he was a hero. One fine day in spring, he took it into his head to go for a stroll, simply walking straight ahead, in the belief that it was the privilege of the human, as of the animal species, to use its legs how it wanted. He had not gone 2 leagues when up came 4 other heroes, each 6 feet tall, who tied him up and carted him off to a dungeon. They asked him which, juridically speaking, he preferred, whether to run the gauntlet of the entire regiment 36 times, or to have 12 lead bullets shot through his brains at one go. It did no good his talking about the freedom of the individual and saying that personally he wished for neither. A choice had to be made. He resolved, by virtue of that gift of God called freedom, to run the gauntlet 36 times. He managed 2. The regiment numbered 2,000 men. For him that meant 4,000 birch strokes, which laid bare every muscle and sinew in his body from the nape of his neck right down to his butt. As they were preparing for his 3rd run, Candide, quite done for, implored them to be so kind as to do him the favour of bashing his head in. This favour was granted. His eyes were bandaged. He was made to kneel. At that moment the king of the Bulgars passed by and inquired what crime the condemned man had committed. As this king was a great genius, he understood from everything that Candide told him that here was a young metaphysician much in ignorance of the ways of the world, and he pardoned him with a clemency that will be praised in every newspaper and in every century. A splendid surgeon cured Candide in 3 weeks with the emollients prescribed by Dioscorides. He already had a little skin and could walk when the king of the Bulgars joined battle with the king of the Avars. Chapter 3. How Candide escaped from the Bulgars and what became of him. Never was there anything so fine, so dashing, so glittering, or so well regulated as those two armies. The trumpets, the fifes, the hautboys, the drums and the cannon produced a harmony such as was never heard in hell. First the cannon felled about 6,000 men on each side. Then the musketry removed from the best of all worlds 9,000 or 10,000 ruffians who were polluting its surface. The bayonet, too, was the sufficient reason for the death of a few thousand. The sum total may well have come to about 30,000 souls. Candide, who was trembling like a philosopher, hid himself as best he could during this heroic butchery. At length, while the two kings were having Te Deum sung in their respective camps, he made up his mind to go and think about cause and effect elsewhere. He climbed over the heaps of dead and dying, and came first to a neighbouring village. It was in ashes. This was an Avar village which the Bulgars had burnt to the ground in accordance with international law. In one part, old men riddled with shot looked on as their wives lay dying, their throats slit and clutching their children to blood-spattered breasts. In another, young girls lay disemboweled, having satisfied the natural urges of a hero or two, breathing their last. Others, half burnt to death, cried out for someone to finish them off. Brains lay scattered on the ground beside severed arms and legs. Candide fled as fast as he could to another village. It belonged to Bulgars, and Avar heroes had given it the same treatment. Candide, continually stepping over quivering limbs or through the midst of ruins, eventually left the battlefield behind, taking with him some few provisions in his bag, and with Miss Cunegonde never far from his thoughts. His provisions had run out by the time he reached Holland, but having heard that the people there were all rich and all Christians, he had no doubt that he would be treated as well as he had been in the Baron's castle before he'd been turned out, on account of Miss Cunegonde's pretty eyes. He begged alms of several solemn personages, who all replied that if he continued in this occupation, he would be locked up in a house of correction and taught how to earn a living. He then spoke to a man who, all on his own, had just been addressing a large gathering for a whole hour on the subject of charity. This orator scowled at him and said, "What are you doing here? Do you support the good cause?" "Well, there is no effect without a cause," replied Candide humbly. "Everything is connected in a chain of necessity, and has all been arranged for the best. It was necessary that I should be separated from Miss Cunegonde, and that I should run the gauntlet, and it is necessary that I should beg for my bread until such time as I can earn it. All this could not have been otherwise." "My friend," said the orator, "do you believe that the Pope is the Antichrist?" "I've never heard that before," replied Candide. "But whether he is or he isn't, I need bread." "You don't deserve to eat it," said the other. "Be off with you, you rogue. Away with you, you miserable wretch, and don't you come near me ever again." The orator's wife, having stuck her head out of the window and set eyes on a man who could doubt that the Pope was the Antichrist, poured a pot full of over his head. Heavens! To what lengths the ladies do carry their religious zeal. A man who had never been baptized, a worthy Anabaptist named Jacques, saw the cruel and ignominious treatment being meted out in this way to one of his brothers, a living being with 2 feet, no feathers, and possessed of a soul. He took him home with him, cleaned him up, gave him some bread and beer, presented him with 2 florins, and even wanted to train him for work in his factories, which produced that Persian material that is made in Holland. Candide, almost prostrate before him, exclaimed, Maitre Pangloss was quite right when he told me that everything in this world is for the best, for I am infinitely more touched by your extreme generosity than by the harshness of that gentleman with the black hat and his lady wife." The next day, while out walking, he met a beggar all covered in sores. His eyes were glazed, the end of his nose was eaten away, his mouth was askew, his teeth black, and he spoke from the back of his throat. He was racked by a violent cough, and spat out a tooth with every spasm. Chapter 4. How Candide chanced upon his old philosophy tutor Dr. Pangloss, and what came of it. Candide, again more moved by compassion than by disgust, gave this appalling beggar the 2 florins which he had received from his worthy Anabaptist, Jacques. The phantom stared at him, wept, and fell upon his neck. Candide, startled, recoiled. "Alas," said the one unfortunate to the other, "do you no longer recognize your dear Pangloss?" "What do I hear? You? My dear tutor? You in this dreadful state? But what misfortune has befallen you? Why are you no longer in the most beautiful of castles? What has become of Miss Cunegonde, that pearl of a daughter, that masterpiece of nature?" "I'm all in," said Pangloss. Whereupon Candide took him to the Anabaptist stable, where he gave him a little bread to eat, and when Pangloss had recovered, said, "Well, what about Cunegonde?" "She is dead," replied the other. Candide fainted on hearing this. His friend brought him round with some old vinegar that was lying about in the stable. Candide opened his eyes. "Cunegonde is dead. Ah, best of all worlds, where are you now? But what did she die of? It wouldn't have been at seeing me kicked out of her father's beautiful castle, would it?" "No," said Pangloss. "She was eviscerated by Bulgar soldiers after they'd raped her as many times as anyone can be. They smashed the Baron's head in as he tried to protect her. The Baroness was hacked to pieces. My poor pupil received precisely the same treatment as his sister, and as for the castle, not one stone remains standing on another. Not a single barn or sheep or duck or tree is left. But we had our revenge, for the Abars did exactly the same to the neighbouring barony of a Bulgar lord." At this account, Candide fainted again. But having recovered his senses, and said everything one should say in such circumstances, he inquired as to the cause and the effect and the sufficient reason which had reduced Pangloss to such a woeful state. "Alas," said the other, "the answer is love. Love, the solace and comfort of the human race, the preserver of the universe, the soul of all sentient beings. Tender love." "Alas," said Candide, "I too have known it, this love of yours, this sovereign ruler of the heart, this soul of our soul. All the good it ever did me was one kiss and a score of kicks up the backside. How can this fine cause have had such an abominable effect on you?" Pangloss replied in these terms, "Oh, my dear Candide, you knew Paquette, that pretty lady's maid to our noble Baroness. In her arms I tasted the delights of paradise, and in turn they have led me to these torments of hell by which you see me now devoured. She had the disease, and may have died of it by now. Paquette was made a present of it by a very knowledgeable Franciscan who had traced it back to its source, for he had got it from an old countess, who had contracted it from a captain in the cavalry, who owed it to a marchioness, who had it from a page, who had caught it from a Jesuit, who, during his novitiate, had inherited it in a direct line from one of Christopher Columbus's shipmates. For my part, I shall give it to no one, because I'm dying." "Oh, Pangloss," cried Candide, "what a strange genealogy! Was it not the devil who began it?" "Not at all," replied the great man. "It was an indispensable part of the best of all worlds, a necessary ingredient. For if Columbus, on an island in the Americas, had not caught this disease which poisons the spring of procreation, which often even prevents procreation, and which is evidently the opposite of what nature intended, we would have neither chocolate nor cochineal. Moreover, one must remember that up till now this disease has been unique to the inhabitants of our continent, like controversy. The Turks, the Indians, the Persians, the Chinese, the Siamese, the Japanese, they have all yet to know it. But there is sufficient reason for them to know it in their turn a few centuries hence. In the meantime, it is making spectacular progress among our population, and especially among those great armies of fine, upstanding, well-bred mercenaries who decide the destiny of nations. One can be sure that when 30,000 soldiers are fighting against a similar number in pitched battle, there are about 20,000 cases of the pox on either side. "Well, isn't that extraordinary?" said Candide. "But you must go and get treated." "And how am I supposed to do that?" said Pangloss. "I haven't a penny, my friend, and in the whole wide world you can't so much as be bled or have an enema without paying for it, or without someone else paying for you." These last remarks decided Candide. He went and threw himself at the feet of his charitable Anabaptist Jacques, and painted such a poignant picture of the state to which his friend was reduced, that the good fellow did not hesitate to take Dr. Pangloss under his roof, and he had him cured at his own expense. In the process, Pangloss lost but one eye and one ear. He could write well, and had a perfect grasp of arithmetic. Jacques the Anabaptist made him his bookkeeper. 2 months later, having to go to Lisbon on business, he took his 2 philosophers with him on the ship. Pangloss explained to him how things could not be better. Jacques was not of this opinion. "Men must surely have corrupted nature a little," he would say, "for they were not born wolves, and yet wolves they have become. God gave them neither 24-pounders nor bayonets, and they have made bayonets and 24-pounders in order to destroy each other. I could also mention bankruptcies, and the courts who seize the assets of bankrupts and cheat their creditors of them." "That was all indispensable," was the one-eyed doctor's reply. "Individual misfortunes contribute to the general good, with the result that the more individual misfortunes there are, the more all is well." While he was presenting his argument, the air grew thick. The winds blew from the 4 corners of the earth, and the ship was assailed by the most terrible storm, within sight of the port of Lisbon. Chapter 5. Storm, Shipwreck, Earthquake, and what became of Dr. Pangloss, Candide, and Jacques the Anabaptist. Half the passengers on board, weakened and near dead from those unimaginable spasms that the rolling of a ship can induce in every nerve and humour of the body by tossing them in opposite directions, did not even have the strength to worry about the danger. The other half shrieked and prayed. The sails were rent, the masts were smashed, the ship broke up. Work as they might, no one could make himself understood, and there was no one in charge. The Anabaptist was helping out with the rigging down on the decks. Furious, a sailor came up, gave him a good clout, and laid him flat on the boards. But the force of the blow jerked him so violently that he himself fell head first overboard and ended up suspended in mid-air, hanging from a piece of broken mast. Kind Jacques ran to his rescue, helped him back on board, and in the process was precipitated into the sea in full view of the sailor, who left him to perish without so much as a backward glance. Along came Candide, saw his benefactor momentarily reappear on the surface and then sink without trace, and wanted to jump in after him. Pangloss the philosopher prevented him, arguing that Lisbon harbour had been created expressly so that the Anabaptist would be drowned in it. While he was proving this a priori, the ship foundered and everyone perished, except for Pangloss, Candide, and the brute of a sailor who had drowned the virtuous Anabaptist. The blackguard swam safely to the very shore where Pangloss and Candide were also carried, on a plank. When they had recovered a little, they proceeded on foot towards Lisbon. They had some money left, and hoped with this to escape hunger, just as they had survived the storm. Scarcely had they set foot in the city, still weeping over the death of their benefactor, than they felt the earth quake beneath their feet. In the port, a boiling sea rose up and smashed the ships lying at anchor. Whirlwinds of flame and ash covered the streets and public squares. Houses disintegrated, roofs were upended upon foundations, and foundations crumbled. 30,000 inhabitants of both sexes and all ages were crushed beneath the ruins. The sailor said with a whistle and an oath, "There'll be some rich pickings here." "What can be the sufficient reason for this phenomenon?" wondered Pangloss. "The end of the world is come!" Candide shouted. The sailor forthwith dashed into the midst of the rubble, braving death in search of money. He duly found some, grabbed it, got drunk, and having slept it off, bought the favours of the first willing girl he met among the remains of the ruined houses, among the dying and the dead. Pangloss, however, took him aside. "My friend," he said, "this is not right. You are in breach of universal reason, and this is hardly the moment." "Hell's teeth," replied the other. "I'm a sailor and I come from Batavia. 4 times I've trampled on the crucifix, on 4 separate voyages to Japan. You've picked the wrong man, you and your universal reason." 1 or 2 fragments of stone had injured Candide. He was lying in the street covered in rubble. He kept calling out to Pangloss, "Help! Get me some wine and oil, I'm dying." "This earthquake is nothing new," replied Pangloss. "The city of Lima felt the same tremors in America last year. Same causes, same effects. There must be a vein of sulphur running underground from Lima to Lisbon." "Nothing is more probable," said Candide. "But for God's sake, get me some oil and wine." "What do you mean probable?" the philosopher retorted. "I maintain that the thing is proven." Candide lost consciousness, and Pangloss brought him some water from a nearby fountain. The next day, having located some food by crawling about among the rubble, they recovered their strength a little. Then they worked like everyone else at giving assistance to the inhabitants who had survived. One group of citizens they had helped gave them as good a dinner as was possible in such a disaster. It is true that the meal was a sad one, and the company wept over their bread, but Pangloss consoled them by assuring them that things could not be otherwise. "For all this is the best there is. If the volcanic activity is in Lisbon, it means it could not have been anywhere else. For it is impossible for things not to be where they are, for all is well." A little man in black, an agent of the Inquisition, was sitting next to him. He intervened politely and said, "Apparently, sir, does not believe in original sin. For if everything is as well as can be, there has been neither fall nor punishment." "I most humbly beg your Excellency's pardon," replied Pangloss even more politely. "But the fall of man and the curse entered necessarily into the scheme of the best of all possible worlds." "So, sir, does not believe in freedom," said the agent. "Your Excellency will forgive me," said Pangloss. "Freedom can exist alongside absolute necessity, for it was necessary for us to be free. For ultimately, the will once determined—" Pangloss was in the middle of his sentence when the agent nodded to his henchman, who was pouring him some port, or rather, Oporto wine. Chapter 6. How they had a splendid auto de fe to prevent earthquakes, and how Candide was flogged. After the earthquake, which had destroyed 3/4 of Lisbon, the wise men of the country had not been able to come up with any more effective means of preventing total ruin than to give the people a splendid auto de fe. It was decided by the University of Coimbra that the spectacle of a few people being ceremonially burnt over a low flame is the infallible secret of preventing earthquakes. Consequently, they had arrested a man from Biscay who had been found guilty of marrying his fellow godparent, and 2 Portuguese who had removed the bacon when eating a chicken. After dinner, men came and tied up Dr. Pangloss and his disciple Candide, one for what he had said, and the other for having listened with an air of approval. Both were led away to separate apartments, which were extremely cool and where the sun was never troublesome. A week later, they were both dressed in a San Benito, and paper mitres were placed upon their heads. Candide's mitre and San Benito were painted with flames that were upside down, and with devils which had neither claws nor tails. But Pangloss's devils had claws and tails, and his flames were the right way up. So dressed, they walked in procession and listened to a very moving sermon, followed by a beautiful recital of plain chant. Candide was flogged in time to the singing. The man from Biscay and the 2 men who'd not wanted to eat bacon were burned, and Pangloss was hanged, despite the fact that this was not the custom. The very same day, the earth quaked once more. The din was fearful. Terrified, confounded, thoroughly distraught, all bleeding and trembling, Candide reflected to himself, "If this is the best of all possible worlds, then what must the others be like? I wouldn't mind if I'd only been flogged. That happened with the Bulgars, but oh, my dear Pangloss, you, the greatest of philosophers, did I have to see you hanged without my knowing why? Oh, my dear Anabaptist, you, the best of men, did you have to drown in the port? Oh, Miss Cunegonde, you pearl among daughters, did you have to get your stomach slit open?" He was just leaving the scene afterwards, scarcely able to stand up, and having been preached at, flogged, absolved, and blessed, when an old woman came up to him and said, "Take courage, my son, follow me." Chapter 7. How an old woman took care of Candide, and how he was reunited with the one he loved. Candide did not take courage, but he did follow the old woman into a hovel. She gave him a pot of ointment to rub on himself, set things out for him to eat and drink, and indicated a small, moderately clean bed, beside which lay a full set of clothes. "Eat, drink, and sleep," she said, "and may Our Lady of Atocha, His Eminence St. Anthony of Padua, and His Eminence St. James of Compostela watch over you. I'll be back tomorrow." Candide, still astonished at all he had seen and suffered, and even more astonished at the charity of the old woman, wanted to kiss her hand. "It's not my hand you should be kissing. I'll be back tomorrow. Rub yourself with ointment, eat and sleep." Candide, despite so many misfortunes, ate and slept. The next day the old woman brought him breakfast, inspected his back, and rubbed a different ointment on it herself. Then she brought him dinner, and in the evening she returned with supper. The day after that she went through the same ritual again. "Who are you?" Candide kept asking her. "What has made you so kind? How can I repay you?" The good woman did not answer. She returned that evening bringing nothing for supper. "Come with me," she said, "and not a word." She took him by the arm and walked with him for about a quarter of a mile into the country. They arrived at a house standing on its own, surrounded by gardens and waterways. The old woman knocked at a little door. Someone opened it. She led Candide up a secret staircase into a small gilded room, left him sitting on a brocaded couch, shut the door after her, and departed. Candide thought he was dreaming. His whole life seemed to him like a bad dream, and the present moment a sweet one. The old woman soon reappeared. She was supporting with some difficulty the trembling figure of a majestic-looking woman, all sparkling with jewels and hidden by a veil. "Remove this veil," the old woman told Candide. The young man drew near. With a timid hand, he lifted the veil. What a moment! What a surprise! He thought he was looking at Miss Cunegonde. He was indeed looking at her, for it was she. His strength failed him, words failed him, and he fell at her feet. Cunegonde fell on the couch. The old woman showered them with various waters. They came to their senses. They spoke to each other. At first it was all half-finished sentences and questions and answers getting crossed and sighs and tears and exclamations. The old woman suggested they make less noise and left them to it. "What? It is you," said Candide. "You're alive. To think that I should find you in Portugal. So you weren't raped. So you didn't have your stomach slit open as Pangloss the philosopher assured me you did." "I certainly was and did," said the fair Cunegonde. "But those two particular misfortunes are not always fatal." "But were your father and mother killed?" "That is only too true," said Cunegonde tearfully. "And your brother?" "My brother was killed too." "And why are you in Portugal? And how did you know that I was here? And how on earth did you arrange to have me brought to this house?" "I will tell you all these things," the young lady replied. "But first you must tell me all that has happened to you since that innocent kiss you and although he was at a loss for words, and his voice was weak and quavering, and his spine still hurt a little, he was at a loss for words, and his voice was weak and quavering, and his spine still hurt a little. He gave her the most artless account of all that had happened, and she shed tears at the deaths of the good Anabaptist Pongloss. After which she spoke in these terms to Candide, deaths of the good Anabaptist and Pongloss. After which she spoke in these terms to Candide, who missed not a word, and devoured her with his eyes. Chapter 8. Cunegonde's Story. I was in bed fast asleep when it pleased Cunegonde's Story. I was in bed fast asleep when it pleased heaven to send the Bulgars into our beautiful castle of Thunder Ten Tronk. They slit the throats of my father and brother and hacked my mother to pieces. A great big Bulgar, 6 feet tall, seeing that I had passed out at the sight of all this, began to rape me. That brought me round. I came to, screamed, struggled, bit him, scratched him. I wanted to tear that big Bulgar's eyes out, little realizing that what was taking place in my father's castle was standard practice. The brute knifed me in the left side, and I still have the scar. Dear, oh dear, I hope I may see it, said the guileless Candide. You shall, said Cunegonde, but let me continue. Go on, said Candide. She took up the thread of her story thus. A Bulgar captain came into the room and saw me all covered in blood. The soldier didn't take any notice. The captain became angry at this lack of respect being shown him by the brute and killed him where he lay on top of me. Then he had me bandaged up and took me to his quarters as a prisoner of war. I used to wash what few shirts he had, and I cooked for him. He found me very pretty, I must admit, and I won't deny he was a good-looking man himself, with skin that was white and soft. Apart from that, not much brain, not much of a thinker. You could tell he hadn't been educated by Dr. Pongloss. 3 months later, having lost all his money and grown tired of me, he sold me to a Jew called Don Issachar, who was a dealer in Holland and Portugal, and who was passionately fond of women. This Jew became much attached to my person, but he was unable to get the better of it. I resisted his advances more successfully than I had the Bulgar soldiers. A woman of honour may be raped once, but her virtue is all the stronger for it. In an attempt to win me over, the Jew brought me here to this country house. I had previously thought that there was nothing in the world as beautiful as the castle of Thunder Ten Tronk. I have been disabused. The Grand Inquisitor noticed me one day during Mass. He kept eyeing me, and then sent word that he had to speak to me on a confidential matter. I was taken to his palace. I told him who I was. He pointed out how far beneath my station it was to belong to an Israelite. It was suggested on his behalf to Don Issachar that he should cede me to his eminence. Don Issachar, who is the court's banker and a man of some influence, would have none of it. The Inquisitor threatened him with an auto de fe. In the end, under intimidation, my Jew agreed to a deal whereby the house and I would belong to both of them jointly. The Jew would have Mondays, Wednesdays and the Sabbath, and the Inquisitor would have the other days of the week. This convention has been operating for 6 months now. It has not been without its quarrels, for it has often been a moot point which Sabbath the period from Saturday night to Sunday morning belongs to, the Old Testament one or the New. For my own part, I have resisted both men up till now, and I'm sure that's why they still love me. Anyway, in order to ward off the scourge of the earthquakes and to intimidate Don Issachar, it pleased my lord and master the Inquisitor to celebrate an auto de fe. He did me the honour of inviting me. I had a very good seat, and the ladies were served refreshments between the Mass and the execution. I was horrified, it must be said, to see those 2 Jews being burnt, as well as that nice man from Biscay who had married his fellow godparent. But how surprised, how shocked, how upset I was to see someone that looked like Pongloss in a San Benito and wearing a mitre. I rubbed my eyes, stared, saw him hanged, and fainted. I had hardly come to when I saw you standing there stark naked. That was my moment of greatest horror and consternation, the moment of greatest pain and despair. I can tell you truthfully, your skin is even fairer and more perfectly pink than my Bulgar captain's. The sight of it lent added force to all the feelings which were surging through me and devouring me. I screamed. I wanted to shout out, "Stop, you animals!" but nothing came out, and anyway my screaming and shouting would have done no good. "How is it," I said to myself, "when you had been well and truly flogged, that nice Candide and wise Pangloss come to be in Lisbon, and that one of them gets 100 lashes, and the other is hanged by order of his Eminence the Inquisitor, who in turn is in love with me? So Pangloss deceived me cruelly when he told me that all was well with the world. Distressed, agitated, beside myself with anger one minute and ready to faint clean away the next, all I could think about was the massacre of my father and mother and brother, the insolence of my ugly Bulgar soldier, and the knife wound he gave me, my bondage, my menial work as a cook, my Bulgar captain, my ugly Don Issachar, my abominable Inquisitor, the hanging of Dr. Pangloss, that great miserere they sang in plain chant while you were being flogged, and above all, that kiss I gave you behind a screen the day I last saw you. I praise God for bringing you back to me after so many trials and tribulations. I instructed my old servant to tend to you and bring you here as soon as she could. She has carried out my commission most capably. I have had the indescribable pleasure of seeing you again, of hearing you and speaking to you. You must have a terrible hunger, and I have a large appetite. Let's begin with supper." With which they both sat down to eat. After supper they resumed their positions on the aforementioned beautiful couch. There they were when Señor Don Issachar, one of the masters of the house, arrived. It was the Sabbath. He had come to enjoy his rights and press his suit. Chapter 9. What became of Cunegonde, Candide, the Grand Inquisitor, and a Jew. This Issachar was the most irascible Hebrew in the tribe of Israel since the time of the captivity in Babylon. "What?" he said. "You whore of Galilee! So Mr. Inquisitor isn't enough for you then? I've got to share you with this infidel too." With these words, he drew a long dagger which he always carried with him, and, not thinking his adversary would be armed, attacked Candide. But the old woman had given our good Westphalian a fine sword with his suit of clothes. Gentle though his disposition was, he drew his sword, and that was it. One Israelite stone dead on the floor at the feet of the fair Cunegonde. "Holy Virgin," cried she, "what is to become of us? A man killed in my house. If the police come, we're lost." "If Pangloss had not been hanged," said Candide, "he would have given us some good advice in this predicament, for he was a great philosopher. Since he's not here, let's ask the old woman." She was a most prudent sort, and was just beginning to give her opinion, when another little door opened. It was 1 hour after midnight. Sunday was beginning. This day belonged to His Eminence the Inquisitor. In he came to find Candide, who had been flogged, now standing sword in hand, with a corpse stretched out on the ground, Cunegonde in a fluster, and the old woman giving advice. Here is what went through Candide's mind at that moment, and how he reasoned. "If this holy man calls for help, he will certainly have me burned. He may well do the same to Cunegonde. He has already had me mercilessly whipped. He is my rival. I've already started killing. There's nothing else for it." This reasoning was clear and quick, and without giving the Inquisitor the time to recover from his surprise, he ran him through and hurled him down beside the Jew. "Well, here's a fine mess," said Cunegonde. "There's no going back now. That's us excommunicated. Our last hour has come. How is it that someone as soft-hearted as you can have ended up killing a Jew and a prelate in a matter of minutes?" "My dear girl," replied Candide, "when a man's in love, jealous and flogged by the Inquisition, there's no knowing what he may do." The old woman then broke in and said, "There are 3 Andalusian horses in the stable, as well as saddles and bridles. Let brave Candide get them ready. Madam has moidores and diamonds. Let us mount quickly, though my seat is but 1 buttock, and ride to Cadiz. The weather is of the best, and it is always a great pleasure to travel in the cool of the night." At once Candide saddled up the 3 horses. Cunegonde, the old woman, and he covered 30 miles without stopping. While they were making their escape, The holy Hermandad reached the house. They buried His Eminence in a beautiful church and threw Issachar onto the rubbish heap. Candide, Cunegonde and the old woman had by this time reached the small town of Avicena in the middle of the Sierra Morena mountains, where they had the following conversation in an inn. Chapter 10. In what distress Candide, Cunegonde and the old woman arrived in Cadiz, and of their embarkation. "But who can possibly have stolen my pistoles and diamonds?" sobbed Cunegonde. "What will we live on? How shall we manage? Where will I find the Inquisitors and the Jews to replace them?" "Alas," said the old woman, "I have a strong suspicion it was that Franciscan monk who spent yesterday night in the same inn as us at Badajoz. God preserve me from jumping to conclusions, but he did come into our room twice, and he did leave long before us." "Oh dear," said Candide. "Good Pangloss often used to argue that the fruits of the earth are common to all, and that everyone has an equal right to them. According to his principles, that Franciscan ought to have left us enough money behind to finish our journey. Have you really not got anything left, my fair Cunegonde?" "Not a maravedi," said she. "What shall we do?" said Candide. "Let's sell one of our horses," said the old woman. "I can ride behind Miss Cunegonde, even though I have only one buttock to sit on, and we'll make it to Cadiz." There was a Benedictine prior staying in the same hostelry. He bought the horse cheaply. Candide, Cunegonde and the old woman passed through Lucena, Chias and Lebrija, and came at last to Cadiz. There a fleet was being fitted out, and troops were being mustered to go and knock some sense into the Jesuit Reverend Fathers in Paraguay, who were accused of having incited one of their local native hordes to revolt against the kings of Spain and Portugal near the town of San Sacramento. Candide, having served with the Bulgars, performed the Bulgar drill for the general of this little army with so much grace, speed, skill, agility and panache that he was given command of a company of foot. So there he was, a captain. He boarded ship with Miss Cunegonde, the old woman, 2 valets, and the 2 Andalusian horses which had belonged to the Grand Inquisitor of Portugal. During the crossing, they discussed poor Pangloss's philosophy a great deal. "We're going to another world," Candide would say. "I expect it must be there that all is well, for you have to admit, one could grumble rather at what goes on in our one, both physically and morally." "I love you with all my heart," Cunegonde would say, "but my soul is still in something of a state, what with all I've seen and been through." "All will be well," was Candide's reply. "Already the sea in this new world is better than those we have in Europe. It's calmer, and the winds are more constant. It is assuredly the new world, which is the best of all possible worlds." "God willing," said Cunegonde, "but I have been so horribly unfortunate in my own, that my heart is almost closed to hope." "You're complaining," said the old woman. "Alas, you haven't had the misfortunes I have." Cunegonde almost burst out laughing, and found it extremely droll of this little old woman to claim to be more unfortunate than she. "I'm afraid, my good woman," she said to her, "that unless you have been raped by 2 Bulgars, stabbed twice in the stomach, had 2 of your castles demolished, seen 2 mothers and 2 fathers' throats slit before your very eyes, and watched 2 of your lovers being flogged at an auto da fe, then I don't see you bettering me. Added to which, I was born a baroness with 72 heraldic quarterings, and yet I have been a cook." "My young lady," replied the old woman, "you do not know who I am by birth, and if I were to show you my bottom, you would not speak as you do, and you would reserve judgment." This declaration aroused the deepest curiosity in the minds of Cunegonde and Candide. The old woman had this to say to them. Chapter 11. The Old Woman's Story. "My eyes haven't always been bloodshot and red-rimmed. My nose hasn't always come down to my chin, and I haven't always been a servant. I am the daughter of Pope Urban X and the Princess of Palestrina. Until the age of 14, I was brought up in a palace, next to which not one of your German barons' castles would even have done as a stable, and any single one of my dresses was worth more than all the treasures of Westphalia put together. As I grew older, so I grew in beauty, grace, and fine accomplishments. I took pleasure in life. I commanded respect. I had prospects. I was already able to inspire love, and my breasts were forming. And what breasts they were! White and firm, just like those of the Medici Venus. And what eyes! What eyelids! What black eyebrows! What fire burned in my pupils and outshone the sparkling of the stars, as the poets in that part of the world used to tell me. The women who dressed and undressed me would go into ecstasies when they saw me, back and front, and all the men would love to have changed places with them. I was engaged to be married to a sovereign prince of Massa Carrara. What a prince! As handsome as I was beautiful, gentle and charming to a fault, brilliant in mind and ardent in love. I loved him as one does love for the first time. I worshipped him with passionate abandon. Arrangements were made for the wedding. The pomp and magnificence of it. No one had seen the like before. It was one continual round of entertainments, tournaments, opera buffa. And all Italy composed sonnets for me, though not one of them was any good. My moment of bliss was at hand when an old marchioness, who had been my prince's mistress, invited him to take chocolate with her. He died less than 2 hours later after appalling convulsions. But that was a trifle. My mother, being in despair, and yet much less grief-stricken than I, wanted to absent herself for a time from so dreadful a scene. She had a very fine property near Gaeta. We took a ship on a local galley, which was all covered in gilt like the altar of St. Peter's in Rome. What happens? But a corsair from Sale makes straight for us and boards us. Our soldiers defended themselves as if they were the Pope's own. They all knelt down, cast their weapons aside, and asked the corsair for absolution in articulo mortis. At once they were stripped as naked as monkeys, as were my mother and our ladies-in-waiting, and I also. It is a remarkable thing, the eagerness of these gentlemen to undress everybody. But what surprised me more was that they put a finger up all of us in a place where we women ordinarily allow only enema nozzles to enter. This ritual struck me as being most odd. But that's how one judges everything when one's never been abroad. I soon gathered that it was to see if we hadn't hidden any diamonds up there. It has been established practice among civilized seafaring nations since time immemorial. I discovered that those religious gentlemen, the Knights of Malta, never fail to do it when they capture any Turks, men or women. It is one article of the law of nations which has never been infringed. I needn't tell you how hard it is for a young princess to be taken to Morocco as a slave with her mother. You can well imagine all we had to suffer on the pirate ship. My mother was still very beautiful. Our ladies-in-waiting, even our maids, had more charms than there are to be found in the whole of Africa. As for me, I was ravishing. I was beauty, grace itself, and I was a virgin. I wasn't one for long. The flower which had been kept for the handsome prince of Massa Carrara was ravished by the pirate captain. He was a loathsome Negro, who even thought he was doing me a great honor. Yes, indeed. The Princess of Palestrina and I had to be extremely tough to survive everything we went through up until our arrival in Morocco. But enough of this. Such things are so commonplace they're not worth talking about. Morocco was bathed in blood when we arrived. The 50 sons of the Emperor Moulay Ismail each had his own followers, which in effect meant 50 civil wars. Blacks against blacks, blacks against browns, browns against browns, mulattoes against mulattoes. It was one long bloodbath from one end of the empire to the other. We had scarcely disembarked when some blacks belonging to a faction opposed to that of my pirate appeared on the scene, wanting to relieve him of his booty. After the diamonds and the gold, we were the most precious things he had. I was witness to a fight the like of which you in your European climates just never see. The northern races are simply not hot-blooded enough. They don't have that thirst for women that they have in Africa. It's as if you Europeans had milk in your veins, whereas it is vitriol, fire, that flows in the veins of the inhabitants of Mount Atlas and that part of the world. They fought with the fury of the lions and the tigers and serpents of their own country to decide which of them should have us. A Moor grabbed my mother by the right arm. My pirate's lieutenant held on to her left. A Moorish soldier took her by one leg, and one of our other pirates held her by the other. In an instant, almost all our ladies-in-waiting found themselves being torn like this between 4 soldiers. My captain kept me hidden behind him. Scimitar in hand, he was killing anything that stood in the way of his own particular thirst. In the end, I saw all our Italian women and my mother torn apart, cut to pieces, massacred by the monsters who were fighting over them. My fellow captives and their captors, soldiers, sailors, blacks, browns, whites, mulattoes, and finally my captain, all were killed, and I lay dying on top of a pile of corpses. Similar scenes were taking place, as you know, over an area more than 300 leagues across, and never once did they fail to say the 5 daily prayers ordered by Mohammed. I extricated myself with great difficulty from the piled heap of all these blood-soaked corpses, and dragged myself over to a tall orange tree next to a nearby stream. There I collapsed in shock, exhaustion, horror, hunger, and despair. Soon afterwards, my shattered senses gave themselves up to a sleep that was more like unconsciousness than the rest. I was in this enfeebled and insensible state, halfway between life and death, when I felt myself being pressed down on by something squirming on my body. I opened my eyes and saw a white man with a friendly face sighing and muttering between his teeth, "Occhi sciagura d'essere senza c-" Chapter 12. The continuing story of the old woman's misfortunes. Astonished and delighted to hear my native tongue, and no less surprised at the words the man was uttering, I replied that there were greater misfortunes than that of which he complained. I informed him in a few words of the horrors to which I had been subjected, and passed out. He carried me to a house nearby, had me put to bed and given something to eat, waited on me, comforted me, flattered me, told me that he had never seen anything so beautiful, and that never had he so much regretted the loss of that which no one could restore to him. I was born in Naples, he told me. They castrate 2,000 or 3,000 children every year there. Some die, some develop a voice more beautiful than any woman's, and some go off and govern the Papal States. They carried out this operation most successfully on me, and I sang in the chapel of the Princess of Palestrina. "My mother!" cried I. "Your mother?" cried he, with tears in his eyes. "What? Then you would be that young princess I taught till she was 6, and who promised even then to be as beautiful as you are." "I am she. My mother lies not 400 yards from here, in 4 pieces, beneath a pile of corpses." I told him everything that had happened to me. He told me his adventures too, and about how one of the Christian powers had sent him as an envoy to sign a treaty with the King of Morocco, whereby this monarch would be supplied with powder, cannon, and ships to assist him in putting an end to the trading of the other Christian powers. "My mission is complete," the worthy eunuch told me. "I am on my way to board ship at Ceuta, and I will take you back to Italy." "Ma che sciagura d'essere senza c-" I thanked him with tears of tender gratitude. Instead of taking me to Italy, he took me to Algiers and sold me to the local Dey. Hardly had I been sold than the plague which was going around Africa, Asia, and Europe broke out with a vengeance in Algiers. You have seen earthquakes, but you, my young lady, have you ever had the plague? "Never," the Baron's daughter replied. "If you had," the old woman went on, "you would agree that it comes well above an earthquake. It is extremely rife in Africa, and I caught it. Can you imagine? What a situation for the 15-year-old daughter of a pope to be in, and for one who in the space of 3 months had suffered poverty and enslavement, been raped almost daily, seen her mother torn limb from limb, survived starvation and war, and was now dying of the plague in Algiers. Die, however, I did not, but my eunuch and the Dey, and almost the entire seraglio at Algiers perished. When the first wave of this appalling plague had passed, they sold the Dey's slaves. A merchant bought me and took me to Tunis. He sold me to another merchant, who in turn sold me in Tripoli. After Tripoli, I was resold in Alexandria. After Alexandria, I was resold in Smyrna, and after Smyrna in Constantinople. In the end, I became the property of an aga in the Janissaries, who shortly afterwards received orders to defend Azov against the Russians, who were laying siege to it. This Aga, who was quite a ladies' man, took his whole seraglio with him, and housed us in a little fort on the Palumeotides, under the guard of 2 black eunuchs and 20 soldiers. An enormous number of Russians were killed, but they gave as good as they got. Azov was put to fire and sword, and no quarter was given either as to sex or to age. All that was left was our little fort. The enemy determined to starve us out. The 20 Janissaries had sworn not to surrender. The extremes of hunger to which they were reduced forced them to eat our 2 eunuchs for fear of breaking their oath. After a few days, they decided to eat the women. We had a very pious and a very understanding imam who preached a fine sermon to them, persuading them not to kill us outright. "Cut off 1 buttock from each of these ladies," he said, "and you will eat well. If you have to come back for more in a few days' time, you'll still be able to have the same again. Heaven will be grateful to you for such a charitable deed, and you will be saved." He was very eloquent. He convinced them. They performed this dreadful operation on us. The imam rubbed on us the ointment they use on children who have just been circumcised. We were all at death's door. Hardly had the Janissaries finished the meal with which we'd provided them than the Russians turned up in flat-bottomed boats. Not 1 Janissary got away. The Russians paid not a blind bit of notice to the state we were in. There are French surgeons all over the world, and a very skillful one took charge of us and made us better. And I shall never forget how once my wounds were well and truly healed, he then propositioned me. That apart, he told us to cheer up and assured us that this sort of thing happened in lots of sieges, and that it was one of the laws of warfare. As soon as my companions could walk, they were sent to Moscow. I was part of a boyar's share of the spoils, and he put me to work in his garden and gave me 20 lashes a day. But after this nobleman was broken on the wheel 2 years later, along with 30 other boyars, because of some trouble or other at court, I took my chance and made my escape. I crossed the whole of Russia. For a long time I served in inns, first in Riga, then in Rostock, Wismar, Leipzig, Kassel, Utrecht, Leiden, The Hague, and Rotterdam. I grew old in poverty and dishonor, having but half a bottom, yet always mindful that I was the daughter of a pope. 100 times I wanted to kill myself, but still I loved life. This ridiculous weakness for living is perhaps one of our most fatal tendencies. For can anything be sillier than to insist on carrying a burden one would continually much rather throw to the ground? Sillier than to feel disgust at one's own existence and yet cling to it? Sillier, in short, than to clasp to our bosom the serpent that devours us, until it has gnawed away our heart. In the countries through which it has been my fate to travel, and in the inns where I have served, I have seen a huge number of people who felt abhorrence for their own lives. But I've seen only a dozen voluntarily put an end to their wretchedness. 3 Negroes, 4 Englishmen, 4 Genevans, and a German professor called Robeck. In the end, I finished up as one of the servants in the household of Don Issachar the Jew. He gave me to you, my fair young lady, as your maid. I have become involved in your destiny, and been more concerned with your adventures than with my own. Indeed, I would never have mentioned my misfortunes if you hadn't provoked me to it a little, and if it were not the custom on board ship to tell stories to pass the time. So there you are, miss. I have lived, and I know the world. Just for fun, why not get each passenger to tell you the story of his life? And if there is one single one of them who hasn't often cursed the day he was born, and hasn't often said to himself that he was the most unfortunate man alive, then you can throw me into the sea, head first. Chapter 13. How Candide was obliged to part from fair Cunegonde and the old woman. Fair Cunegonde, having heard the old woman's story, treated her with all the civilities due to a person of her rank and quality. She accepted her suggestion, and got all the passengers one after another to tell her their adventures. Candide and she conceded that the old woman was right. "It's a great pity," said Candide, "that wise Pangloss was hanged, contrary to the usual custom during an auto da fe. He would have some remarkable things to tell us about the physical and moral evil that prevails over land and sea, and I would feel able to venture a few respectful objections." While each person told his story, the ship continued on its way. They docked at Buenos Aires. Cunegonde, Captain Candide, and the old woman went to call on the governor, Don Fernando de Ibarra y Figueroa y Mascarenas y Lampordos y Susa. This grandee had a pride to match his many names. He spoke to people with the most noble disdain, sticking his nose so far in the air, speaking in such a mercilessly loud voice, adopting so high and mighty a tone, and affecting so haughty a gait, that all who greeted him were also tempted to hit him. He loved women to distraction. Cunegonde seemed to him more beautiful than any he had ever seen. The first thing he did was to ask if she were not by any chance the captain's wife. The air with which he put this question alarmed Candide. He did not dare say she was his wife, because in fact she was not. He did not dare say she was his sister, because she was not that either. And although this white lie had once been very fashionable among the ancients, and could still come in very useful to the moderns, his soul was too pure to be unfaithful to the truth. "Miss Cunegonde," he said, "is to do me the honour of marrying me, and we humbly beseech your excellency to condescend to officiate at our wedding." With a twirl of his moustache, Don Fernando de Ibarra y Figueroa y Mascarenes y Lampordos y Susa smiled a bitter smile, and ordered Captain Candide to go and review his company. Candide obeyed. The governor remained with Miss Cunegonde. He declared his love for her and made protestations that on the morrow he would marry her, in the eyes of the church or anyone else's, just as it might please her lovely self. Cunegonde asked him for a quarter of an hour in which to collect herself, consult with the old woman, and come to a decision. The old woman said to Cunegonde, "Miss, you have 72 quarterings and not a penny to your name. You can be the wife of the greatest nobleman in South America, who also has a very fine moustache. Are you in any position to make a point of unswerving fidelity? You have been raped by the Bulgars. A Jew and an inquisitor have enjoyed your favours. Misfortune does give people some rights. Frankly, if I were in your position, I would have no scruples about marrying the governor and making Captain Candide's fortune for him." While the old woman was speaking with all the prudence of age and experience, a small ship was seen entering the port. On board were an alcalde and some alguacils. What had happened was this. The old woman had quite rightly guessed that it had been the Cordelier with the loose sleeves who had stolen the money and jewels from Cunegonde in the town of Badajoz when she was making her rapid escape with Candide. This monk tried to sell some of the stones to a jeweller. The merchant recognized them as belonging to the Grand Inquisitor. The Franciscan, before being hanged, confessed that he had stolen them. He gave a description of the people concerned and the route they were taking. Cunegonde and Candide were already known to have escaped. They were followed to Cadiz. No time was lost in sending a ship after them, and this ship was already in the port of Buenos Aires. Rumour spread that an alcalde was about to come ashore, and that they were after the Grand Inquisitor's murderers. The prudent old woman saw at once what was to be done. "You cannot run away," she told Cunegonde, "and you have nothing to fear. It wasn't you who killed His Eminence, and anyway, the governor loves you and won't allow any harm to come to you. Stay here." Whereupon she rushed off to Candide. "Quick, off you go," she said, "or in an hour you'll be burnt." There was not a moment to lose. But how could he leave Cunegonde, and where was he to hide? Chapter 14. How Candide and Cacambo were received by the Jesuits of Paraguay. Candide had brought a manservant with him from Cadiz of the kind frequently found along the coast of Spain and in the colonies. He was a quarter Spanish, the son of a half-breed in the Tucumán. He had been a choir boy, sexton, sailor, monk, commercial agent, soldier, and lackey. His name was Cacambo, and he loved his master very much, because his master was a very good man. He saddled up the 2 Andalusian horses as quickly as he could. "Come on, master. Let's do as the old woman says and be off. Let's ride away and no looking back." Candide burst out crying. "Oh, my darling Cunegonde, Must I abandon you just when the governor was going to marry us? Cunegonde, what will become of you so far from home?"
"She'll become what she can," said Cacambo. "Women are never stuck. God sees to that. Let's go."
"Where are you taking me? Where are we going? What will we do without Cunegonde?" said Candide.
"By St. James of Compostela," said Cacambo, "you are going to fight against the Jesuits. Let's go and fight for them instead. I know the roads well enough. I'll take you to their kingdom. They'll be delighted to have a captain who can do drill the Bulgar way. You'll be all the rage. If one doesn't get what one wants in one world, one can always get it in another. It's always a great pleasure to see new places and do different things."
"So you've already been to Paraguay, then?" said Candide.
"I've been there all right," said Cacambo. "I used to be a servant at the College of the Assumption, and I know Los Padres' ways of running things like I know the streets of Cadiz. It's a wonderful way of governing they have. Their kingdom is already more than 300 leagues wide, and it's been divided into 30 provinces. Los Padres owns everything in it, and the people nothing. A masterpiece of reason and justice. If you ask me, nothing could be more divine than Los Padres making war on the kings of Spain and Portugal over here, and being confessors to the very same kings back in Europe, or than killing Spaniards here and speeding them on their way to heaven back in Madrid. It appeals to me, that does. Come on, let's go. You're about to become the happiest man alive. How pleased Los Padres are going to be when they discover there's a captain coming who knows the Bulgar drill."
The moment they arrived at the first border post, Cacambo told the advance guard that a captain was asking to speak to His Eminence, the commanding officer. The main guard was notified. A Paraguayan officer made haste to go and kneel at the feet of the commanding officer and inform him of the news. Candide and Cacambo were first disarmed, and then their 2 Andalusian horses were taken from them. Both strangers were ushered between 2 lines of soldiers. The commanding officer was standing at the far end, with the 3-cornered hat on his head, his cassock hitched up, a sword at his side, and a halberd in his hand. He made a sign. Instantly 24 soldiers surrounded the 2 newcomers. A sergeant told them they must wait, that the commanding officer could not speak to them, that the Reverend Father Provincial did not permit Spaniards to open their mouths unless he was present, or to remain in the country for more than 3 hours.
"And where is the Reverend Father Provincial?" asked Cacambo. "He said mass and now he's taking parade," replied the sergeant. "And he won't be able to kiss his spurs for another 3 hours yet." "But," said Cacambo, "the captain, who incidentally is dying of hunger, as indeed I am, isn't Spanish. He's German. Couldn't we have lunch while we wait for his reverence?"
With this, the sergeant went off to tell the commanding officer what had been said. "May God be praised," said this reverend gentleman. "Well, since he's German, I can speak to him. Show him to my arbour." At once Candide was led into a closet of greenery, embellished with a very pretty colonnade of green and gold marble, and trellis work containing parrots, colibris, hummingbirds, guinea fowl, and all manner of rare birds. An excellent lunch had been laid out in vessels of gold, and while the Paraguayans ate maize from wooden bowls out in the open in the full glare of the sun, the Reverend Father in command entered the arbour. He was a very handsome young man, rather pale-skinned, with a round, ruddy face, arched eyebrows, a keen gaze, red ears, vermilion lips, and a proud demeanour. Though proud in a way quite unlike a Spaniard or a Jesuit. Candide and Cacambo were given back the weapons which had been taken from them, as well as their 2 Andalusian horses. Cacambo gave the latter their oats near the arbour, and kept a watchful eye on them in case of surprise. First Candide kissed the hem of the commanding officer's cassock, and then they all sat down to table. "So you're German, you say?" said the Jesuit in that language. "Yes, Reverend Father," said Candide. As they uttered these words, they looked at each other in absolute astonishment, and with a degree of emotion which it was beyond them to control. "And from which part of Germany do you come?" said the Jesuit. "From the filthy province of Westphalia," said Candide. "I was born in the castle of Thunder Ten Tronckh." "Good heavens! It's not possible!" exclaimed the commanding officer. "It's a miracle!" exclaimed Candide. "Can it really be you?" said the commanding officer. "It's impossible!" said Candide. They both fell back in amazement and kissed each other and wept buckets of tears. "What? Can Can it really be you, Reverend Father? You, the brother of the fair Cunegonde? You who were killed by the Bulgars? You, the son of the Baron? You, a Jesuit in Paraguay? The world really is a very strange place, I must say. Oh, Pangloss, Pangloss, how pleased you would be now if you hadn't been hanged. The commanding officer dismissed the Negro slaves and the Paraguayans who were serving drinks in goblets of rock crystal. He thanked God and St. Ignatius 1,000 times, and he hugged Candide. Their faces were bathed in tears. You will be even more astonished, even more moved, even more beside yourself, said Candide, when I tell you that Miss Cunegonde, your sister whom you thought disemboweled, is in the best of health. Where? Not far from here, with the governor of Buenos Aires. And I was coming over here to fight against you. Each word they uttered in this long conversation piled wonder upon wonder. The soul of each took wing upon his tongue, paid careful heed with either ear, and sparkled in his eyes. Being Germans, they sat on at table for a long time, and while they waited for the Reverend Father Provincial, the commanding officer spoke thus to his dear Candide. Chapter 15. How Candide killed the brother of his dear Cunegonde. For as long as I live, I shall always remember that dreadful day when I saw my father and mother killed and my sister raped. When the Bulgars had gone, my adorable sister was nowhere to be found, and my mother and father and I, together with 2 servant girls and 3 little boys who'd had their throats slit, were placed on a cart to be taken for burial at a Jesuit chapel 2 leagues from our ancestral home. A Jesuit threw some holy water over us. It was horribly salty. A few drops of it went in my eyes. The Reverend Father saw my eyelids quiver. He put his hand on my heart and felt it beating. I was saved, and 3 weeks later you wouldn't have known there'd been anything the matter. You know how good-looking I was, my dear Candide. I became even more so, with the result that the Reverend Father Crust, who was Father Superior, developed the most tender affection for me. He initiated me as a novice. Some time later I was sent to Rome. The Father General had need of a batch of young German Jesuit recruits. The rulers of Paraguay admit as few Spanish Jesuits as they can. They prefer foreign ones in the belief that they can control them better. The Father General thought I was just the right sort of person to go and toil in this particular vineyard, so off we went, a Pole, a Tyrolean, and myself. On arrival I had the honour of being made sub-deacon and lieutenant. Today I am colonel and priest. We shall give the King of Spain's troops a warm reception. They will be excommunicated and beaten, I can promise you. Providence has sent you here to help us. But is it really true that my dear sister Cunegonde is not far away at the governor's in Buenos Aires? Candide swore to him that nothing could be more true. Their tears began once more to flow. The Baron could not desist from embracing Candide. He called him his brother, his saviour. "Ah, my dear Candide," he said, "perhaps we can enter the city as victors, the 2 of us together, and rescue my dear sister Cunegonde." "Oh, there's nothing I'd like better," said Candide, "for I was intending to marry her, and I still hope to." "You insolent man!" retorted the Baron. "You would have the audacity to marry my sister, who has 72 quarterings? I consider it great effrontery on your part to dare speak to me of so rash an intention." Candide's blood turned to stone at such a statement. He answered him, "Reverend Father, all the quarterings in the world have nothing to do with it. I have rescued your sister from the arms of a Jew and an inquisitor. She owes me a number of debts, and she intends to marry me. Maitre Pangloss always told me that men are equal, and marry her I most assuredly will." "We'll see about that, you scoundrel," said the Jesuit Baron of Thunder Ten Tronckh, and so saying, struck him a heavy blow across the face with the flat of his sword. Candide, quick as a flash, drew his own and plunged it up to the hilt into the Jesuit Baron's gut. But as he withdrew it, all steaming, he began to cry. "Oh, dear God," he said, "I've killed my former master, my friend, my brother-in-law. I am the best fellow in the world, and already that makes 3 men I've killed, and 2 of them priests." Cacambo, who had been standing guard at the door of the arbour, came running. "There's nothing for it but to sell our lives dearly," his master said to him. "They're bound to come into the arbour, so we'll have to die fighting." Cacambo, who had seen a thing or two, kept his head. He removed the Baron Jesuit's cassock, put it on Candide, handed him the dead man's biretta, and made him mount his horse. This was all done in a trice.
"Quickly, master, at the gallop. Everyone will take you for a Jesuit dashing off to give orders, and we'll have passed the frontier before they can give chase."
He was already riding like the wind when he said this, shouting out in Spanish,
Make way for the Reverend Father Colonel!"
Chapter 16. What became of the two travellers with two girls, two monkeys, and the savages called the liberos? Candide and his manservant were past the frontier, and still no one in the camp knew the German Jesuit was dead. The vigilant Cacambo had taken care to fill his bag with bread, chocolate, ham, fruit, and a quantity of wine. They rode their Andalusian horses deep into unknown country, where they found no sign of a track. Eventually, a beautiful stretch of grassland, crisscrossed with streams, opened up before them. Our two travellers halted to allow their mounts to graze. Cacambo suggested to his master that they eat something, and duly set him an example. "How do you expect me to eat ham," said Candide, "when I have killed the Baron's son and see myself doomed never to see fair Cunegonde again in my life? What's the use of prolonging my miserable existence if I must drag it out, far away from her in remorse and despair? And what will the Journal de Trévoux say?" So saying, he did not abstain from eating. The sun was setting. The two lost travellers heard one or two faint cries which sounded as though they came from women. They could not tell if they were cries of joy or pain, but they quickly sprang to their feet, full of that apprehension and alarm which anything in a strange land can arouse. The clamour was emanating from two completely naked girls who were scampering along the edge of the meadow, pursued by two monkeys who were nibbling at their bottoms. Candide was moved to pity. He had learned to shoot with the Bulgars, and he could have downed a hazelnut in a thicket without so much as touching a single leaf. He raised his Spanish double-barreled gun, fired, and killed the two monkeys. "God be praised, my dear Cacambo. I have delivered those two poor creatures from great peril. If it was a sin to kill an inquisitor and a Jesuit, I've certainly atoned for it by saving the lives of these two girls. Perhaps the two young ladies are well-to-do, and this chance episode will prove to be of great advantage to us hereabouts." He was about to continue, but he was struck dumb when he saw the two girls throw loving arms around the two monkeys, dissolve into tears over their dead bodies, and rend the air with wails of utmost grief. "I didn't expect the kindness of their hearts to go that far," Candide said at last to Cacambo, who replied,
"A fine thing you've done there, master. You've just killed those two young ladies' lovers."
"They're lovers? Impossible! You're joking, Cacambo. How can they possibly be?"
"My dear master," continued Cacambo, "you're always surprised by everything. Why do you find it so strange that in some countries monkeys should enjoy the favours of the ladies? They're a quarter human, just as I am a quarter Spanish."
"Oh dear," replied Candide. "I remember now Maître Ponglos saying that such accidents did used to happen once upon a time, and that these couplings produced centaurs, fauns, and satyrs, and that several of the great names of antiquity had seen them. But I used to think that it only happened in fables."
"Well, you ought to be convinced now that is true," said Cacambo. "You see how people behave when they haven't had a bit of education? All I hope is that these ladies don't cause us any trouble."
These solid reflections persuaded Candide to leave the meadow and plunge into a wood. There he supped with Cacambo, and having cursed the Inquisitor of Portugal, the Governor of Buenos Aires, and the Baron, they both fell asleep on some moss. When they awoke, they felt unable to move. The reason was that during the night the liberos, who inhabit that country, and to whom the two ladies had denounced them, had pinioned them with rope made of bark. They were surrounded by some 50 naked liberos, armed with arrows, cudgels, and hatchets made of flint. Some of them were warming a large cauldron, others were preparing skewers, and they were all chanting, "It's a Jesuit! It's a Jesuit! We will be avenged! Our stomachs will be full! Let's eat Jesuit! Let's eat Jesuit!"
I told you so, my dear master, cried Cacambo sadly. I told you those two girls would play us false.
Candide, seeing the cauldron and the skewers, exclaimed, "We're going to be roasted or boiled, that's for certain. Oh, what would Maître Pangloss say if he could see how human nature is in its pure state? All is well, so it may be, but I must say it's pretty rotten to have lost Miss Cunegonde and be spit-roasted by liberos." Cacambo was not one to lose his head.
Don't despair, he said to the disconsolate Candide. I know these people's lingo a bit. I'll have a word with them.
"Make sure you point out to them," said Candide, "how frightfully inhuman it is to cook people, and how unchristian it is too."
So, gentlemen, said Cacambo, you think you're going to have Jesuit today. That's fine by me. Nothing could be fairer than to treat your enemies this way. The laws of nature do indeed tell us to kill our neighbor, and that is the way people behave throughout the world. If we ourselves do not exercise our right to eat our neighbor, that's because we've got better things to eat. But you haven't the same resources as we have. Certainly, it is better to eat one's enemies than to leave the fruits of one's victory for the rooks and the crows. But gentlemen, you would not want to eat your friends. You think you're about to skewer a Jesuit, while in fact it's your defender, the enemy of your enemies that you'll be roasting. Me? I was born in these parts. This gentleman here is my master, and far from being a Jesuit, he has just killed a Jesuit and is wearing the spoils of combat. That's how you came to be mistaken. If you want to check the truth of what I say, take his cassock to the nearest frontier post of the Kingdom of Los Padres. Ask them if my master didn't kill a Jesuit officer. It won't take you long, and you'll always be able to eat us anyway if you discover I've lied to you. But if I've told you the truth, you are too well acquainted with the principles, articles, and procedures of international law not to pardon us.
The liberos found this speech very reasonable. They deputed two eminent persons to proceed post-haste to find out the truth. The two deputies carried out their commission like intelligent men, and soon returned bearing good tidings. The liberos untied their two prisoners, did them all kinds of honour, offered them girls, gave them refreshments, and escorted them back to the boundary of their lands, merrily chanting, "He isn't a Jesuit! He isn't a Jesuit!" Candide could not get over the manner of his deliverance. "What a people!" he was saying. "What men! What manners! If I hadn't had the good fortune to run Miss Cunegonde's brother through with a hefty thrust of my sword, I would have been eaten, and without remission of sentence. But human nature in its pure state is good after all, since these people, instead of eating me, were all sweetness and light the minute they knew I wasn't a Jesuit." Chapter 17. The arrival of Candide and his manservant in El Dorado, and what they saw there. When they reached the libero frontier, Cacambo said to Candide,
"You see, this half of the world is no better than the other. Take my advice. Let's head back to Europe by the shortest route possible."
"But how?" said Candide. "And where to? If I go back to my own country, I'll find the Bulgars and Avars busy cutting everyone's throats. If I return to Portugal, I'll be burnt at the stake. And if we stay here, we may end up on a spit at any moment. But how can I bring myself to leave the part of the world that contains Miss Cunegonde?"
"Let's make for Cayenne," said Cacambo. "We'll find the French there. They travel all over the place. They'll be able to help us. Perhaps God will have pity on us."
Getting to Cayenne was no simple matter. They knew roughly which direction to take, but what with mountains, rivers, precipices, brigands, and savages, terrible obstacles presented themselves at every turn. Their horses died of exhaustion. They ran out of provisions, and for a whole month they survived on wild fruits, before they eventually found themselves by a small river lined with coconut palms, which kept both them and their hopes alive. Cacambo, whose advice was always as good as the old woman's had been, said to Candide,
"We've had it. We've walked as far as we can. I see an empty canoe on the bank. Let's fill it with coconuts, get in and let the current take us. A river always leads to some kind of habitation. If we don't find anything nice, at least we'll find something new."
"All right," said Candide. "Let's trust in Providence." They drifted downstream for a few leagues between riverbanks now covered in flowers, now bare of vegetation, now flat, now steep. The river grew wider and wider. At length, it ran under a vault of fearsome-looking rocks that reached high into the sky. The two travellers had the pluck to let the water carry them under this vault. The river, which narrowed at this point, swept them along with horrifying speed and made a terrifying din. 24 hours later, they saw the light of day once more, but their boat was dashed to pieces in the rapids. They had to drag themselves from rock to rock for a whole league. Eventually they came to a vast open space surrounded by impassable peaks. The land had been cultivated as much to give pleasure as to serve a need. Everywhere, whatever was useful was also agreeable. The roads were covered, or rather adorned, with conveyances of the most lustrous form and substance, bearing men and women of singular beauty, and drawn at great speed by large red sheep, who could outpace the finest horses in Andalusia, Tetuan or Mequinez. "This, on the other hand," said Candide, "is something of an improvement on Westphalia." He and Cacambo stepped ashore at the first village they came to. A few village children covered in tattered gold brocade were playing quoits at the entrance to the settlement. Our two men from the other world stopped to watch them. Their quoits were fairly large, round objects, some of them yellow, some red, some green, and they gleamed in an odd way. The travellers were prompted to pick some of them up. They were pieces of gold, emerald and ruby, and the smallest of them would have been the greatest ornament on the Mogul's throne. "No doubt," said Candide, "these children playing quoits are the sons of the king of this country." The village schoolmaster appeared at that moment to call them back to the classroom. "That," said Candide, "must be the royal family's private tutor." The little urchins stopped their game at once, leaving their quoits and everything else they'd been playing with lying on the ground. Candide picked them up, ran to the tutor, and humbly presented him with them, explaining in sign language that their royal highnesses had forgotten their gold and their precious stones. The village schoolmaster threw them on the ground with a smile, stared at Candide for a moment in great surprise, and walked off. The travellers did not fail to gather up the gold, rubies and emeralds. "Where can we be?" exclaimed Candide. "The royal children here must be very well brought up if they're taught to turn their noses up at gold and precious stones." Cacambo was just as surprised as Candide. At length they drew near to the first house in the village. It was built like a European palace. There was a crowd of people at the door, and an even bigger one inside. Some very pleasant music could be heard, and there was a mouth-watering smell of cooking. Cacambo went up to the door and heard Peruvian being spoken. This was his native tongue, for, as everyone knows, Cacambo was born in the Tucumán, in a village where this was the only language they knew. "I'll interpret for you," he told Candide. "Let's go inside. This is an inn." At once, 2 waiters and 2 waitresses, dressed in cloth of gold and wearing ribbons in their hair, showed them to a table and offered them the table d'hôte. The meal consisted of 4 different soups, each garnished with a couple of parrots, then a boiled condor weighing 200 pounds, 2 excellent roast monkeys, 1 platter of 300 colibris, and another of 600 hummingbirds, some exquisite casseroles and delicious pastries. Everything was served on dishes made of a kind of rock crystal. The waiters and waitresses poured out a variety of liqueurs made from sugarcane. The guests were tradesmen and wagoners for the most part, all of them extremely polite. They asked Cacambo 1 or 2 questions with the most scrupulous discretion, and returned full answers to those he put to them. When the meal was over, Cacambo thought, as Candide did, that he could more than cover the cost of their meal by tossing 2 of the large pieces of gold he'd picked up onto the table. The landlord and his wife burst out laughing and held their sides for a long time. Finally they recovered themselves. "Gentlemen," said the host, "we can see you're strangers. We're not used to them here. Forgive us if we started laughing when you offered to pay with the stones off our roads. Presumably you don't have any of the local currency, but you don't need any to dine here. All inns set up for the convenience of those engaged in commerce are paid for by the government. The meal wasn't very good here because this is a poor village, but anywhere else you'll get the kind of reception you deserve." Cacambo interpreted for Candide all that the landlord had said, and Candide was as amazed and bewildered to hear it as Cacambo was to tell it. "What is this place?" said one to the other. which is unknown to the rest of the world, and where the whole nature of things is so different from ours. It's probably the place where all goes well, for there absolutely must be such a place, and whatever Maitre Pangloss might have said, I often observed that everything went rather badly in Westphalia. Chapter 18. What they saw in the land of El Dorado. Cacambo gave the landlord to understand how curious he was to know more. The landlord said, I know very little about things, and that suits me well enough. But we have an old man living in the village who used to be at court and who is the most knowledgeable man in the kingdom, as well as the most communicative. Thereupon he took Cacambo to see the old man. Candide was playing second fiddle now, and it was he who accompanied his servant. They entered a house of a very modest sort, for its front door was only of silver, and the panelling of its room merely gold, though the workmanship was in such good taste that more opulent panelling could not have outshone it. It has to be said that the antechamber was studded only with rubies and emeralds, but the pattern in which they had all been arranged more than made up for this extreme simplicity. The old man received the two strangers on a sofa stuffed with colibri feathers, and gave orders for them to be served various liquors in diamond goblets, after which he satisfied their curiosity in the following fashion.
I am 172 years old, and I learnt from my late father, who was a crown equerry, of the extraordinary upheavals which he witnessed in Peru. This kingdom we are in now is the former homeland of the Incas, who most imprudently left it to go and conquer another part of the world, and ended up being wiped out by the Spanish. The princes of their race who remained behind in their native country were wiser. They ordained, with the consent of the nation, that no inhabitant was ever to leave our little kingdom. And that's how we've managed to remain innocent and happy. The Spanish knew vaguely about the place and called it El Dorado, and an English knight called Raleigh even came fairly near it about 100 years ago. But since we're surrounded by unclimbable rocks and cliffs, we've always hitherto been safe from the rapacity of European nations with their unaccountable fondness for the pebbles and dirt off our land, and who would kill us to the very last man just to lay their hand on the stuff.
Their conversation was a long one, and touched on the form of government there, on local customs, on women, public entertainment and the arts. Eventually Candide, ever one for metaphysics, asked through Cacambo if there was a religion in this country. The old man flushed a little.
But how could you suppose there might not be? He said. What do you take us for? Ungrateful wretches?
Cacambo humbly asked what the religion of El Dorado was. The old man flushed again.
Well, can there be more than one religion? He asked. As far as I know, we have the same religion as everyone else. We worship God from dusk till dawn. Do you worship only one God? Asked Cacambo, who was still acting as interpreter to the doubting Candide. Obviously, said the old man. There aren't 2 gods or 3 or 4. I must say people from your part of the world do ask some very strange questions.
Candide persisted in having further questions put to this genial old man. He wanted to know how they prayed to God in El Dorado.
We don't pray to God, said the good and worthy sage. We have nothing to ask him for. He has given us all we need, and we never cease to thank him.
Candide was curious to see the priests. He had Cacambo ask where they were. The kindly old man smiled.
My friends, he said, we are all priests. The king and the head of each family sing hymns of thanksgiving solemnly every morning, to the accompaniment of 5,000 or 6,000 musicians.
What? You mean you don't have any monks to teach and dispute and govern and intrigue and burn people to death who don't agree with them?
We'd be mad to, said the old man. We're all of like mind here, and we can't see the point of your monks.
Each of these remarks left Candide in raptures, and he kept thinking to himself, this is all rather different from Westphalia and his lordship's castle. If our friend Pangloss had seen El Dorado, he would no longer have said that the castle of Thunder Ten Tronckh was the best place on earth. Just goes to show, travel's the thing. After this long conversation, the kind old man had 6 sheep harnessed to a carriage and lent the 2 travellers 12 of his servants to take them to the court.
"Forgive me," he said to them, "if my advancing years deprive me of the honour of accompanying you. You will not be dissatisfied with the way the king receives you, and I am sure you will be tolerant of our customs if any are not to your liking."
Candide and Cacambo stepped into the carriage. The 6 sheep went like the wind, and in less than 4 hours they had arrived at the palace of the king, situated at one end of the capital. The main entrance was 220 feet high and 100 wide. There are no words to describe what it was made of, which in itself gives some idea of just how prodigiously superior it was to the sand and pebbles we call gold and precious stones. 20 beautiful guardswomen received Candide and Cacambo upon arrival, escorted them to the baths, and dressed them in robes of hummingbird down, after which the grand officers and the grand dames of the crown led them to His Majesty's apartments between 2 lines of musicians, each 1,000 strong, in accordance with normal protocol. As they approached the throne room, Cacambo asked one of the grand officers what to do when being presented to His Majesty. Should one fall on one's knees or flat on the ground? Should one put one's hands on one's head or over one's backside? Should one lick the dust off the floor? In a word, what was the done thing?
"It is customary," said the grand officer, "to embrace the king and kiss him on both cheeks."
Candide and Cacambo fell upon His Majesty's neck. He welcomed them with all imaginable graciousness and politely asked them to supper. Before then they were shown round the city, with its public buildings raised and praised to the skies, its marketplaces decorated with 1,000 columns, its fountains of spring water and rose water and sugar-cane liquors, all playing ceaselessly in the middle of large squares paved with special stones, which gave off an aroma similar to that of clove and cinnamon. Candide asked to see the law courts. He was told there weren't any, and that there were never any cases to hear. He asked if there were any prisons, and he was told there weren't. What surprised him most and gave him the greatest pleasure was the Palace of Science, in which he saw a gallery 2,000 feet long, all full of instruments for the study of mathematics and physics. Having seen about 1,000th part of the city in the course of the entire afternoon, they were then brought back to the king. Candide sat down to table next to His Majesty, his servant Cacambo, and several ladies. Never did anyone dine better, and never was anyone wittier at supper than His Majesty. Cacambo interpreted the king's bon mots for Candide, and even in translation they still seemed bon. Of all the things that surprised Candide, this was not what surprised him the least. They spent a month in this hospice. Candide never stopped saying to Cacambo, "It's true, my friend, and I'll say it again. The castle where I was born is nothing compared to this place. But still, Miss Cunegonde isn't here, and doubtless you have some sweetheart back in Europe. If we stay on here, we'll simply be the same as everyone else. Whereas if we return to Europe with even a mere dozen sheep loaded up with Eldorado pebbles, then we'll be richer than all the kings put together. We'll have no more inquisitors to worry about, and we'll easily be able to get Miss Cunegonde back." Cacambo liked what he heard. Such is the desire to be always on the move, to be somebody, and to show off about what you've seen on your travels, that the 2 happy men resolved to be happy no longer, and to ask leave of His Majesty to depart.
"You're making a great mistake," the king told them. "I know my country isn't up to much, but when one is reasonably content in a place, one ought to stay there. But I certainly have no right to stop strangers from leaving. That is a piece of tyranny which has no part in our customs or our laws. All men are free. Leave when you wish, though getting out is difficult. It is impossible to return up the rapids, which, by a miracle, you managed to come down. The river runs under vault after vault of rock. The mountains which surround my kingdom are 10,000 feet high and as sheer as a city wall. Each one is about 10 leagues thick, and the only way down the other side is one long cliff face. However, since you are absolutely determined to leave, I shall give orders for the machine intendants to make one which will transport you in comfort. When they've got you to the other side of the mountains, no one will be able to accompany you any further. for my subjects have vowed never to set foot outside these boundaries, and they're too sensible to break their vow. Apart from that, you can ask me for whatever you want." "All we ask of your majesty," said Cacambo, "is a few sheep laden with provisions and pebbles and some of the local dirt." The king laughed. "I really don't understand this passion you Europeans have for our yellow dirt," said the king, "but take all you want, and much good may it do you." He immediately ordered his engineers to make a machine to windlass these two extraordinary men out of his kingdom. 3,000 of the best scientists worked on it. It was ready in a fortnight, and cost no more than the equivalent of £20,000 sterling in local currency. Candide and Cacambo were installed on the machine, together with 2 large red sheep saddled up for them to ride when they had crossed the mountains, 20 pack sheep laden with provisions, 30 carrying a selection of the best local curios and gifts the country could offer, and 50 loaded up with gold, diamonds, and other precious stones. The king embraced the 2 wanderers and bid them a fond farewell. They presented quite a sight as they departed, as did the ingenious way in which they were hoisted, men and sheep together, to the top of the mountains. The scientists took their leave of them once they were safely across, and Candide was left with no other desire or object but to go and present Miss Cunegonde with his sheep. "We have the wherewithal to pay the governor of Buenos Aires now," he said, "if a price can be put on Miss Cunegonde, that is. Let's head for Cayenne and take a ship there, and then we'll see what kingdom we're going to buy." Chapter 19. What happened to them in Suriname and how Candide met Martin. For our 2 travellers, the first day's journey passed pleasantly enough. They were spurred on by the prospect of themselves as owners of more treasures than Asia, Europe and Africa can muster between them. Candide, quite carried away, carved the name of Cunegonde on trees as he passed. On the second day, 2 of their sheep became bogged down in a swamp and were swallowed up with their entire load. A few days afterwards, 2 more sheep died of exhaustion. 7 or 8 then starved to death in a desert. Others fell down some mountainsides a day or 2 later. In the end, after 100 days of journeying, they had only 2 sheep left. Said Candide to Cacambo, "My friend, you see how perishable are the riches of this world. The only sure thing is virtue and the happiness of seeing Miss Cunegonde again." "I'm sure," said Cacambo, "but we do still have 2 sheep left and more treasure than the King of Spain will ever have. And in the distance I can see a town which I suspect is Suriname, where the Dutch are. Our troubles are over, and the good times are just beginning." As they drew near to the town, they came on a negro lying on the ground half naked, which in his case meant in half a pair of short denim breeches. The poor man was missing his left leg and his right hand. "My God," said Candide in Dutch, "what are you doing lying here, my friend, in this dreadful state?" "I'm waiting for my master, Mr. Van der Hartbargen, the well-known trader," replied the negro. "And is it Mr. Van der Hartbargen," said Candide, "who has treated you like this?" "Yes, sir," said the negro. "It is the custom. We're given 1 pair of short denim breeches twice a year, and that's all we have to wear. When we're working at the sugar mill and catch our finger in the grinding wheel, they cut off our hand. When we try to run away, they cut off a leg. I have been in both these situations. This is the price you pay for the sugar you eat in Europe. However, when my mother sold me for 10 Patagonian crowns on the coast of Guinea, she said to me, 'My dear child, bless our fetishes, worship them always. They will bring you a happy life. You have the honour of being a slave to our lords and masters the whites, and by so being, you are making your father's and mother's fortune.' Alas, I don't know if I made their fortune, but they didn't make mine. Dogs, monkeys, parrots, they're all 1,000 times less wretched than we are. The Dutch fetishes who converted me tell me every Sunday that we're all the sons of Adam, whites and blacks alike. I'm no genealogist, but if these preachers are right, we're all cousins born of first cousins. Well, you'll grant me that you can't treat a relative much worse than this." "Oh, Pangloss," cried Candide, "this is one abomination you never thought of. That does it. I shall finally have to renounce your optimism." "What's optimism?" asked Cacambo.
I'm afraid to say, said Candide, that it's a mania for insisting that all is well when things are going badly. And he began to weep as he gazed at his negro, and he entered Suriname in tears. The first thing they inquired about was whether there were a ship in the port which could be sent to Buenos Aires. The person they approached happened to be a Spanish skipper, who offered to name them a fair price himself. He arranged to meet them in an inn. Candide and the faithful Cacambo went to wait for him there along with their 2 sheep. Candide, whose heart was always on his lips, told the Spaniard all about his adventures, and confessed that he wished to carry off Miss Cunegonde. "I'm not taking you to Buenos Aires, that's for sure," said the skipper. "I'd be hanged, and so would you. The fair Cunegonde is His Excellency's favourite mistress." This came as a bolt from the blue to Candide. He wept for a long time. Eventually he took Cacambo to one side. "Look, my dear friend," he said to him, "this is what you must do. We've each got about 5 or 6 million in diamonds in our pockets. You're cleverer than I am. Go and fetch Miss Cunegonde from Buenos Aires. If the governor makes difficulties about it, give him 1 million. If he won't budge, give him 2. You haven't killed any inquisitors. They won't be suspicious of you. I'll have another ship made ready. I'll go and wait for you in Venice. Theirs is a free country where one has nothing to fear from Bulgars or Avars or Jews or inquisitors." Cacambo applauded this wise decision. He was in despair at the thought of parting from so good a master who had become his close friend. But the pleasure of being of use to him outweighed the pain of leaving him. They tearfully embraced each other. Candide told him to make sure and not forget the kind old woman. Cacambo left the same day. He was a very fine fellow, Cacambo. Candide stayed some while longer in Suriname, waiting to find another skipper who would be prepared to take him and his 2 remaining sheep to Italy. He engaged servants and bought everything he needed for a long voyage. At last, Mr. van der Hartbargen, the master of a large ship, came and introduced himself. "How much will you charge," he asked this man, "to take myself, my servants, my baggage, and these 2 sheep directly to Venice?" The master asked 10,000 piastres. Candide did not hesitate. "Hullo," the careful van der Hartbargen said to himself. "This stranger parts with 10,000 piastres just like that. He must be pretty rich." He came back at him a moment later and indicated that he could not sail for less than 20,000. "Very well then, you shall have them," said Candide. "Blow me," said the merchant under his breath. "This man parts with 20,000 piastres as easily as 10. He came back at him once more and said that he could not take him to Venice for less than 30,000 piastres. "Then 30,000 it is," replied Candide. "Hello indeed," the Dutch merchant said to himself again. 30,000 piastres are nothing to this man. Those 2 sheep must be carrying immense treasures. Better not press things any further. Let's get paid the 30,000 piastres first, and then we'll see." Candide sold 2 little diamonds, the smaller of which was worth more than all the money the shipmaster was asking. He paid him in advance. The 2 sheep were loaded on board. Candide was following behind in a small boat to join the ship moored out in the roads, when the master calmly set his sails and weighed anchor. The wind favoured him. Candide, helpless and quite flabbergasted, soon lost sight of him. "Alas," he lamented, "that's just the kind of dirty trick you'd expect from the old world." He returned to the shore in deep misery, for after all he had lost what would have been enough to make the fortune of 20 monarchs. He took himself off to the Dutch resident magistrate, and as he was a little upset, knocked rather peremptorily on the door. In he went, explained what had happened to him, and shouted rather more loudly than was proper. The magistrate began by fining him 10,000 piastres for the noise he had made. Then he listened to him patiently, promised to look into his case as soon as the merchant returned, and charged him a further 10,000 piastres for the cost of the hearing. This treatment was the last straw for Candide in his despair. To be sure, he had suffered misfortunes 1,000 times more grievous, but the sang-froid of the magistrate and of that shipmaster who had robbed him stirred his bile and plunged him into a black melancholy. The wickedness of men struck him in all its ugliness, and his mind fed on images of gloom. Finally, there being a French vessel all ready to sail for Bordeaux, and as he had no more sheep laden with diamonds to place aboard, He paid for a cabin on the ship at the standard price, and made it known in the town that he would pay passage and board for and give 2,000 piastres to any respectable person who would make the journey with him, on condition that this person was the most disgusted with his lot and the unhappiest man in the province. A crowd of applicants came forward such as an entire fleet could not have carried. Wanting to choose among the most likely candidates, Candide selected 20 who seemed to him fairly companionable and who all claimed to deserve preference. He got them together in his inn and gave them supper on condition that each would swear to give a faithful version of his story. He undertook to choose the one who would seem to him most to be pitied and to have the greatest reason for being the most dissatisfied with his lot. To the others he promised a small consideration. The session lasted until 4 o'clock in the morning. Candide, as he listened to all their adventures, recalled what the old woman had said to him on their way to Buenos Aires, and how she had wagered that not a single person on board would not have suffered very great misfortunes. He thought of Pangloss with every story he was told. Pangloss, he said, would be hard put to it to prove his system. I wish he were here. One thing's certain. If all is going well, it's happening in El Dorado and not in the rest of the world. In the end, he decided in favour of a poor scholar who had spent 10 years working for the publishing houses of Amsterdam. He took the view that there was no form of employment in the world with which one could possibly be more disgusted. This man of learning, who was a perfectly decent fellow moreover, had been robbed by his wife, assaulted by his son, and abandoned by his daughter, who had eloped with a Portuguese. He had just been removed from a small post which had provided him with a living, and the preachers of Suriname were persecuting him because they took him for a Socinian. It must be admitted that the other applicants were at least as unhappy as him, but Candide hoped that the scholar would keep him amused on the voyage. All his rivals considered that Candide was doing them a great injustice, but he pacified them by giving them 100 piastres each. Chapter 20. What happened to Candide and Martin at sea? So the old scholar, who was called Martin, took ship for Bordeaux with Candide. Both had seen much and suffered much, and even if the ship had had to sail all the way from Suriname to Japan via the Cape of Good Hope, they would still have had matter enough to sustain their discussion of physical and moral evil throughout the entire voyage. However, Candide had one great advantage over Martin, which was that he was still hoping to see Miss Cunegonde again, while Martin had nothing to hope for. Moreover, he had gold and diamonds, and although he had lost 100 large sheep laden with the greatest treasure on earth, and although the Dutch master's villainy still rankled, nevertheless, when he thought about what he had left in his pockets, and when he talked about Cunegonde, especially at the end of a meal, then he would be inclined to favour the philosophical system of Pangloss. "But you, Mr. Martin," he said to the scholar, "what are your thoughts on all this? How do you see physical and moral evil?" "Sir," replied Martin, "my priests accuse me of being a Socinian, but the fact of the matter is that I am a Manichaean." "You're pulling my leg," said Candide. "There aren't any Manichaeans left any more." "There's me," said Martin. "I can't help it. I just can't see things any other way." "It's the devil in you," said Candide. "He's mixed up in the affairs of this world to such an extent," said Martin, "that he may well be in me, just as he's in everything else. But to be frank, when I look about me on this globe, or rather this globule, I begin to think God has abandoned it to some malign being, apart from El Dorado, that is. I've scarcely seen one town that did not wish the ruination of its neighbour, or one family that did not want to see the end of another. Everywhere you look, the weak execrate the strong while they grovel at their feet, and the strong treat them like so many sheep, providing wool and meat to be sold. 1 million regimented assassins, rushing from one end of Europe to the other, commit murder and brigandage by the rule-book in order to earn their daily bread, because there is no more respectable profession. And in the cities, where people appear to live in peace and the arts flourish, men are devoured by more envy, worry, and dissatisfaction than all the scourges of a city under siege. Secret sorrows are more cruel even than public tribulations. In short, I have seen so many of them and suffered so many that I am a Manichaean." Yet there is good, Candide would answer.
That's as maybe, Martin would say, but I've never met it.
In the middle of this debate, they heard the sound of cannon fire. The noise increased by the moment. Each of them grabbed his telescope. 2 ships were to be seen engaging at a distance of about 3 miles. The wind brought both of these ships so close to the French vessel that they had the pleasure of seeing the engagement in perfect comfort. Eventually one ship let fly a broadside at the other that was so low and so accurate that it sank it. Candide and Martin could distinctly see 100 men on the deck of the ship which was going down. They were all raising their hands heavenwards and letting out the most appalling screams. In an instant, everything disappeared beneath the waves.
Well, there you are, said Martin. That's how men treat each other.
It is true, said Candide. The devil has had a hand in this business. So saying, he noticed something bright red swimming near their ship. The ship's launch was lowered to go and see what it could be. It was one of his sheep. There was more joy in Candide at finding this one sheep than there had been sorrow at losing 100-fold, all laden with large Eldorado diamonds. The French captain soon observed that the captain of the sinker was Spanish, while the captain of the sunk was a Dutch pirate. It was the very man who had robbed Candide. The immense riches with which this villain had absconded had gone down with him, and all that had been saved was one sheep. "You see," Candide said to Martin, "crime is sometimes punished. That scoundrel of a Dutch skipper got the fate he deserved."
"Yes," said Martin, "but did the passengers on his ship have to perish also? God punished the rogue. The devil drowned the rest."
Meanwhile, the French and Spanish ships resumed their voyages, and Candide and Martin their conversations. They argued for a solid fortnight, and at the end of the fortnight they were as far forward as the day they began. But well, they talked and exchanged ideas and consoled each other. Candide would stroke his sheep and say, "I have found you, so I may well be able to find Cunegonde." Chapter 21. Candide and Martin approached the French coast and reasoned together. At last they came in sight of the French coast. "Have you ever been to France, Mr. Martin?" said Candide.
"Yes," said Martin. "I've travelled through several of its provinces. There are some where half the inhabitants are mad, 1 or 2 where they're too clever by half, some where they're generally quite gentle and rather stupid, and others where they try to be witty. And in all of them the principal occupation is love. Next comes slander and gossip, and third comes talking nonsense."
"But, Mr. Martin, have you been to Paris?"
"Yes, I've been to Paris. There they have all of these types. It's chaos there, a throng in which everyone is searching for pleasure and where practically no one finds it, at least not as far as I could see. I haven't spent much time there. When I arrived, I was robbed of everything I had by pickpockets at the Saint-Germain fair. I myself was taken for a thief and spent a week in prison, after which I did some proofreading to earn enough to be able to return to Holland on foot. I got to know the pen-pushing brigade, and the political intriguers and the religious convulsions crowd. They say there are some very well-mannered people in that city. I dare say there are."
"Personally, I have no desire to see France," said Candide. "As I'm sure you can imagine, when one's spent a month in El Dorado, there's nothing in the world one much wants to see other than Miss Cunegonde. I'm on my way to wait for her in Venice. We will be going through France to get to Italy. Why don't you come with me?"
"Delighted to," said Martin. "They say Venice is only fit to live in if you're a Venetian nobleman, but that foreigners are well looked after nonetheless, providing they have a lot of money. I haven't. You have. I'll follow you anywhere."
"Incidentally," said Candide, "do you believe the earth was originally a sea, as they say it was in that big book the captain has?"
"I don't believe anything of the sort," said Martin. "No more than I believe any of the other rubbish they've been coming out with recently."
"But for what purpose was this world created, then?" said Candide.
"To drive us mad," replied Martin.
"Don't you find it absolutely amazing," Candide went on, "the way the 2 girls I told you about, the ones who lived in the land of the Liberos, loved those 2 monkeys?"
"Not at all," said Martin. I don't see what's odd about that particular passion. I've seen so many extraordinary things that nothing's extraordinary anymore.
Do you think, said Candide, that men have always massacred each other the way they do now? That they've always been liars, cheats, traitors, ingrates, brigands? That they've always been feeble, fickle, envious, gluttonous, drunken, avaricious, ambitious, bloodthirsty, slanderous, debauched, fanatical, hypocritical, and stupid?
Do you think, said Martin, that hawks have always eaten pigeons when they find them?
Yes, no doubt, said Candide.
Well then, said Martin, if hawks have always had the same character, why do you expect men to have changed theirs?
Oh, said Candide, well, there's a big difference, because free will...
Arguing thus the while, they arrived in Bordeaux. Chapter 22. What happened to Candide and Martin in France? Candide broke his journey in Bordeaux just long enough to sell a few Eldorado pebbles and to procure a good post-chaise with 2 seats, for he could no longer be without Martin, his philosopher. He was only very sorry to be parted from his sheep, which he left with the Academy of Science at Bordeaux. They set as the subject of that year's prize the question why the wool of this sheep was red, and the prize was awarded to a scientist from the north who proved by A plus B minus C divided by Z that the sheep had necessarily to be red and to die of sheep pox. Meanwhile, all the travellers Candide met in the inns along the way told him, "We're off to Paris." In the end, this universal eagerness made him want to see that capital city. It would not take him much out of his way on his journey to Venice. He entered by the Faubourg Saint-Marceau, and thought he was in the ugliest village in Westphalia. Scarce had Candide put up at his inn than he was laid low by a minor indisposition brought on by his exertions. As he had an enormous diamond on his finger, and as an extremely heavy strongbox had been noticed among his luggage, he soon had by him 2 doctors whom he had not sent for, a number of bosom companions who never left his side, and 2 ladies of good works who were heating up his broth. Martin said, "I remember being ill on my first trip to Paris too. I was very poor, so I had no friends or do-gooders or doctors, and I got better." Meanwhile, by dint of many potions and bloodlettings, Candide's illness became serious. A local priest came and kindly asked him for a confessional note payable to bearer in the other world. Candide would have none of it. The ladies of good works assured him that it was the new fashion. Candide replied that he was not a one for fashion. Martin was for throwing the priest out of the window. The clerics swore that Candide would not be granted burial. Martin swore that he would bury the cleric if he continued to bother them. The quarrel grew more heated. Martin took him by the shoulders and unceremoniously ejected him. This caused a great scandal, which was the subject of an official inquiry. Candide recovered, and during his convalescence he had some very fine company to supper with him. There was gambling for high stakes. Candide was most surprised never to get a single ace, and Martin was not surprised. Among those who did him the honours of the city was a little abbé from Périgord, one of those busy little pushy, fawning, frightfully accommodating types, always on the make, always ready to please, who lie in wait for strangers passing through, and give them all the local gossip and scandal, and offer them entertainments at all sorts of prices. This one took Candide and Martin to the theatre first. A new tragedy was on. Candide found himself sitting next to some of the intellectual smart set. This did not prevent him from crying at scenes that were played to perfection. One of these arbiters of taste sitting near him said to him during an interval, "You're quite wrong to cry. That actress is very bad. The actor playing opposite her is still worse. The play is even worse than the actors. The author doesn't know a word of Arabic, and yet the play is set in Arabia. And what's more, the man doesn't believe in innate ideas. Tomorrow I can bring you 20 pamphlets criticising him." "Sir, how many plays do you have in France?" Candide asked the abbé, who replied, 5,000 or 6,000. "That's a lot," said Candide. "How many of them are any good?" 15 or 16 was the answer. "That's a lot," said Martin.
Candide was much taken with an actress who was playing Queen Elizabeth in a rather dull tragedy which is sometimes put on. "I do like that actress," he said to Martin. "She looks a bit like Miss Cunegonde. I should be rather pleased to call on her." The abbé from Périgord offered to effect an introduction. Candide, brought up in Germany, asked what the form was and how Queens of England were treated in France. "We must distinguish," said the abbé. "In the provinces you take them to an inn. In Paris you respect them when they're beautiful and you throw them on the rubbish heap when they're dead." "Queens on the rubbish heap?" said Candide. "Yes, really," said Martin. "The abbé is right. I was in Paris when Mademoiselle Monime passed, as they say, from this life to the next. She was refused what people here call the honours of the grave. That is to say, of rotting in a filthy cemetery with all the beggars of the neighbourhood. Unlike the rest of her troupe, she was buried alone at the corner of the Rue de Bourgogne, which must have pained her exceedingly, for she thought very nobly." "Well, that's not a very nice way to treat people," said Candide. "What can you expect?" said Martin. "That's the way they are round here. Take any contradiction or inconsistency you can think of, and you will find it in the government, the courts, the churches, or the theatres of this strange nation." "Is it true that people in Paris are always laughing?" inquired Candide. "Yes," said the abbé, "but through gritted teeth, for they complain about everything with great gales of laughter, and they laugh even when doing the most detestable things." "Who," asked Candide, "was the fat pig who was telling me so many bad things about that play I cried such a lot at, and about those actors I liked so much?" "He is evil incarnate," replied the abbé. "He earns his living by decrying all new plays and books. He hates the up-and-coming writer just as eunuchs hate the up-and-coming lover. He's one of those vipers of literature that feed off filth and venom. He's a hack." "What do you mean by hack?" said Candide. "I mean," said the abbé, "someone who churns out articles by the dozen, a frérot." Such was the discussion between Candide, Martin, and the man from Périgord as they stood on the staircase, watching people pass by on their way out after the play. "Although I can't wait to see Miss Cunegonde again," said Candide, "nevertheless I would like to have supper with Mademoiselle Clairon, for she did seem quite admirable to me." The abbé was not the right man for an approach to Mademoiselle Clairon, who moved only in the best circles. "She has a prior engagement this evening," he said, "but if you will allow me the honour of taking you to a lady of quality, there you will get to meet Paris society as if you'd already been living here for years." Candide, who was curious by nature, allowed himself to be taken to the lady at the bottom end of the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. There they were busy playing faro. 12 sad punters each held a small hand of cards, the dog-eared register of their misfortunes. A profound silence reigned. Pallor was upon the punter's brows, anxiety upon that of the banker, and the lady of the house, seated beside this implacable banker, noted with the eyes of a lynx all the doubling up and any illegal antes whenever each player turned down the corner of his card. She would make them turn the corners back with firm but polite insistence, and never lost her temper for fear of losing her clients. This lady called herself the Marchioness of Double-Outfits. Her daughter, aged 15, was one of the punters, and would indicate with a wink any cheating on the part of these poor people endeavouring to repair the cruel blows of fate. The abbé from Périgord, Candide and Martin walked in. No one got up, or greeted them, or looked at them. They were all deeply engrossed in their cards. "The Baroness of Thunder Ten Tronckh was more civil," said Candide. Meanwhile the abbé had a word in the ear of the Marchioness, who half rose and honoured Candide with a gracious smile, and Martin with a thoroughly grand tilt of the head. She had Candide given a seat and dealt a hand. He lost 50,000 francs in 2 rounds. Afterwards they supped merrily, and everyone was surprised that Candide was not more upset about his losses. The lackeys said to each other in their own lackey language, "He must be one of your English lords." The supper was like most suppers in Paris. First, silence. Then a cacophonous welter of words which no one can make out. And then jokes, which mostly fall flat, false rumours, false arguments, a smattering of politics, and a quantity of slander. They even talked about the latest books. "Have you read," said the abbé from Périgord, "that nonsense by Master Gauchard, Doctor of Theology?" "Yes," replied one of the party, "but I couldn't finish it. There's enough irrelevant rubbish in print as it is, but the whole lot put together doesn't come anywhere near the irrelevance of Master Gauchard, Doctor of Theology. I'm so sick of this great flood of detestable books that I've taken to punting at Faro. As a miscellany of Archdeacon T? What do you think of that?" said the abbé. "Oh," said the Marchioness of Dubel-Auschwitz, "that crashing bore. The way he tells you with great interest what everybody knows already. The ponderous discussion of points that aren't even worth a passing reference. The witless way he borrows other people's wit. How he ruins what he filches. How he disgusts me. But he won't disgust me any further. 1 or 2 pages of the Archdeacon are quite enough." At table there was a man of taste and learning, who agreed with what the Marchioness was saying. Conversation then moved on to tragedies. The lady asked why it was that some tragedies were staged from time to time, but were totally unreadable. The man of taste explained very well how a play could be of some interest but of almost no merit. He showed in a few words how it was not enough to contrive 1 or 2 of the stock situations which can be found in any novel, and which always captivate the audience, but that one had to be original without being far-fetched, often sublime and always natural, to know the human heart and to make it speak, to be a great poet without any of the characters in the play appearing to be poets themselves, to have perfect command of one's own language, and to use it with fluent euphony, without forcing it, and without ever sacrificing the sense to the rhyme. Whoever fails to follow every one of these rules, he added, may produce 1 or 2 tragedies that are applauded in the theatre, but he will never be counted a good writer. There are very few good tragedies. Some are simply idylls in a dialogue that happens to be well written and well rhymed. Some have political messages and send you to sleep, while others are so overdone they fail to move. And some are the fantasies of fanatics, written in a barbarous style with broken-off sentences and long speeches to the gods, because they don't know how to communicate with human beings, and full of false maxims and pompous platitudes. Candide listened attentively to these remarks and formed a high opinion of the speaker. As the Marchioness had taken good care to place Candide next to her, he took the liberty of asking, by means of a whisper in her ear, who this man was who spoke so well. "He's a man of learning," said the lady, "who doesn't gamble and whom the abbé brings to supper sometimes. He knows all about tragedies and books, and he has himself written a tragedy which was whistled off the stage, and a book, of which but 1 copy has ever been seen outside a bookshop, and that was the one he presented to me with the dedication." "A great man," said Candide. "He's another Pangloss." Then turning to him, he said, "Sir, doubtless you think that everything is for the best in the physical and moral worlds, and that things could not be other than as they are." "Aye, sir," replied the man of learning, "I don't think anything of the sort. I find that everything in our world is amiss, that nobody knows his place or his responsibility or what he's doing or what he should do, and that except for supper parties, which are quite jolly and where people seem to get on reasonably well, the rest of the time is spent in pointless quarrelling. Jansenists with Molinists, parliamentarians with churchmen, men of letters with men of letters, courtiers with courtiers, financiers with the general public, wives with husbands, relatives with relatives. It's one battle after another." Candide answered him, "I've seen worse. But a wise man, who has since had the misfortune to be hanged, told me that that's all fine. Those are just the shadows in a beautiful painting." "Your hanged man was having people on," said Martin. "What you call shadows are horrible stains." "It's human beings who make the stains," said Candide. "They can't help it." "So it's not their fault," said Martin. The majority of the punters, who did not understand a word of all this, were drinking. Martin had a discussion with the man of learning, and Candide recounted some of his adventures to the lady of the house. After supper, the Marchioness took Candide to her room and bid him be seated on a couch. "Well then," she said to him. "So you're still madly in love with Miss Cunegonde de Thunder-ten-Tronckh?" "Yes, madame." The Marchioness returned a tender smile. "You answer like the young man from Westphalia you are. A Frenchman would have said to me, 'It is true that I did once love Miss Cunegonde, but on seeing you, madame, I fear that I love her no longer.'" "Oh dear," said Candide. "Madame, I shall answer as you please." "Your passion for her began," said the Marchioness, "when you picked up her handkerchief. I want you to pick up my garter." "With all my heart," said Candide, and he picked it up. "But I want you to put it back for me," said the lady, and Candide put it back for her. "You see," she said, "you are a foreigner. Sometimes I make my Parisian lovers wait a whole fortnight, but here I am, giving myself to you on the very first night, because one must do the honours of one's country to a young man from Westphalia." The fair lady, having noticed 2 enormous diamonds on the hands of her young foreigner, enthused about them with such sincerity that from Candide's fingers they passed on to the fingers of the Marchioness. Candide, as he returned home with his abbé from Périgord, felt some remorse at having been unfaithful to Miss Cunegonde. The abbé commiserated with him. He was only slightly responsible for the 50,000 francs Candide had lost at cards, and the value of the 2 brilliants, which had been half given and half extorted. His object was to profit as much as he possibly could from the advantages that knowing Candide might bring him. He asked him all about Cunegonde, and Candide told him that he would certainly beg that fair lady's pardon for his infidelity when he saw her in Venice. The man from Périgord became even more courteous and attentive, and took a touching interest in everything that Candide said or did, or wanted to do. "So you have arranged to meet in Venice then, sir?" he said. "Yes, monsieur l'abbé," said Candide. "I really must go and find Miss Cunegonde." Then, drawn on by the pleasure of talking about the one he loved, he recounted, as was his wont, a part of his adventures with this illustrious Westphalian lady. "I expect Miss Cunegonde is witty and clever," said the abbé, "and that she writes charming letters." "I've never had any from her," said Candide. "The thing is, you see, having been kicked out of the castle for loving her, I couldn't write to her, and then I learnt soon afterwards that she was dead, and then I found her again, and then I lost her, and then I sent an express messenger 2,500 leagues to her, and I'm still awaiting a reply." The abbé listened attentively, and seemed somewhat lost in thought. Soon he took his leave of the 2 strangers after embracing them warmly. The next day, upon waking, Candide received the following letter. "My very dear and beloved sir, I have been lying ill in this city for the past week. I discover that you are here too. I would fly to your arms if I could move. I heard in Bordeaux that you had passed through. I left the faithful Cacambo there, and the old woman, and they're soon to follow on after me. The governor of Buenos Aires took everything, but I still have your heart. Come to me. Your presence will restore me to life, or make me die of pleasure." This charming, this unexpected letter sent Candide into transports of inexpressible joy, while the illness of his dear Cunegonde weighed him down with grief. Torn between these 2 emotions, he grabbed his gold and diamonds and had someone take him and Martin to the hotel where Miss Cunegonde was staying. He entered the room trembling with emotion, his heart aflutter, his voice choked. He made to open the curtains round the bed and was about to send for a lamp. "Do no such thing," said the maid. "The light will kill her." And at once he shut the curtains. "My dear Cunegonde," wept Candide, "how are you? If you cannot look at me, at least speak to me." "She cannot speak," said the maid. The lady then drew from the bedclothes a chubby little hand, which Candide bathed with his tears for a long time, and subsequently filled with diamonds, leaving a pouch full of gold on the chair. In the midst of his transports, an officer of the watch arrived, followed by the abbé from Périgord and a squad of men. "Are these the 2 suspicious foreigners then?" he said. He had them arrested on the spot and ordered his lads to haul them off to prison.
"Well, this is not how they treat travellers in El Dorado," said Candide.
"I feel more Manichaean than ever," said Martin.
"But, sir, where are you taking us?" said Candide.
"To the deepest of dark dungeons," said the officer. Martin, having recovered his sang-froid, judged that the lady claiming to be Cunegonde was a fraud, the abbé from Périgord a scoundrel who had taken advantage of Candide's innocence at the earliest opportunity, and the officer another scoundrel, whom it would be easy to be rid of. Rather than be exposed to the process of law, Candide, enlightened by Martin's counsel, and more especially ever impatient to see the real Miss Cunegonde again, offered the officer 3 little diamonds, worth about 3,000 pistoles each.
"Ah, sir,"
the man with the ivory baton said to him,
"had you committed every crime in the book, you'd still be the most honest man alive. 3 diamonds, and each worth 3,000 pistoles? Sir, I'd sooner die for you than take you to a dungeon. There are orders to arrest all foreigners, but leave it to me. I have a brother in Normandy, in Dieppe. I'll take you there. And if you have a diamond or 2 to give him, he'll take care of you as if it were myself he was looking after."
"And why are they arresting all foreigners?" says Candide. The abbé from Périgord intervened.
"It's because a wretch from Atrabatia listened to some silly talk, which was all it took to make him commit parricide. Not like the one in May 1610, but like the one in December 1594, and like several others committed in other months and other years by other wretches who had listened to similar silly talk."
The officer then explained what this was all about.
"Ah, the monsters!" exclaimed Candide.
"What? Such horrors, and from a people that love singing and dancing! Can't I leave this very minute? Let me out of this country where monkeys provoke tigers. I have seen bears in my own country. I have seen men only in El Dorado. In the name of God, officer, take me to Venice, where I am to wait for Miss Cunegonde."
"Lower Normandy is the best I can do," said the right arm of the law.
Thereupon he had his irons removed, said he must have made a mistake, dismissed his men, and took Candide and Martin to Dieppe, and left them in the hands of his brother. There was a small Dutch ship out in the roads. The Norman, who with the help of 3 more diamonds had now become the most obliging of men, put Candide and his servants aboard the ship, which was about to set sail for Portsmouth in England. It was not the way to Venice, but Candide felt as though he was being delivered from hell, and he fully intended to rejoin the route to Venice at the first opportunity. Chapter 23. Candide and Martin proceed to the shores of England, what they see there. "Ah, Pangloss, Pangloss! Ah, Martin, Martin! Ah, my dear Cunegonde! What sort of a world is this?" Candide was asking on board the Dutch ship. "A rather mad and rather awful one," answered Martin. "You know England. Are they as mad there as they are in France?" "It's a different kind of madness," said Martin. "As you know, the 2 countries are at war over a few acres of snow across in Canada, and they're spending more on this war than the whole of Canada is worth. To tell you exactly if there are more people who should be locked up in one country than in the other is something my feeble lights do not permit. All I know is that by and large, the people we are going to see are extremely glum." Thus conversing, they landed at Portsmouth. A multitude of people covered the shore, all gazing intently at a rather stout man who was kneeling blindfold on the deck of one of the naval ships. 4 soldiers, posted opposite this man, each fired 3 shots into his skull, as calmly as you please, and the assembled multitude then dispersed, thoroughly satisfied. "What is all this?" said Candide, "and what demon is it that holds such universal sway?" He asked who this stout man was who had just been ceremonially killed. "He's an admiral," came the answer. "And why kill this admiral?" "Because he didn't kill enough people," Candide was told. "He gave battle to a French admiral, and it's been found that he wasn't close enough." "But," said Candide, "the French admiral was just as far away from the English admiral as he was from him." "Yeah, unquestionably," came the reply, "but in this country it's considered a good thing to kill an admiral from time to time so as to encourage the others." Candide was so dumbfounded and so shocked by what he was seeing and hearing that he refused even to set foot ashore, and he negotiated with the Dutch master of the ship. It was just too bad if he fleeced him like the one in Suriname, to take him to Venice as soon as possible. The master was ready in 2 days. They sailed down the French coast. They passed within sight of Lisbon, and Candide shuddered. They entered the straits in the Mediterranean. At last they put in at Venice. "God be praised," said Candide, embracing Martin. "This is where I shall see fair Cunegonde again. I trust Cacambo as I would myself. All is well, all is going well, all is going as well as it possibly can." Chapter 24. Of Paquette and Brother Giroflée. As soon as he reached Venice, he instigated a search for Cacambo in every inn and coffee house, and in all the brothels. He was nowhere to be found. Each day he had inquiries made of every new ship or boat that came in. No sign of Cacambo. "I don't know," he was saying to Martin. "I've had time to cross from Suriname to Bordeaux, to go from Bordeaux to Paris, from Paris to Dieppe, from Dieppe to Portsmouth, to sail the length of Portugal and Spain, to cross the entire Mediterranean, to spend several months in Venice, and fair Cunegonde has still not got here. All I've encountered instead is some hussy and an abbé from Périgord. Cunegonde is probably dead, so I may as well die too. Oh, it would have been better to remain in the paradise of El Dorado than come back to this accursed Europe. How right you are, my dear Martin. All is but illusion and calamity." He sank into a dark melancholy and took no part in the opera alla moda or in any of the other carnival entertainments. Not a single lady caused him a moment's temptation. Martin said to him, "You really are rather simple to imagine that a half-caste manservant with 5 or 6 millions in his pocket will go and look for your lady love on the other side of the world and bring her to you in Venice. He'll take her for himself if he finds her. If he doesn't find her, he'll take somebody else. My advice to you is to forget your manservant Cacambo and your beloved Cunegonde." Martin was not consoling. Candide's melancholy deepened, and Martin kept on proving to him that there was little virtue and little happiness in this world, except perhaps in El Dorado, where no one could ever go. While they disputed this important subject and waited for Cunegonde, Candide noticed a young Theatine monk in St. Mark's Square who was walking with a girl on his arm. The Theatine had a fresh, chubby, robust appearance. His eyes shone, and there was an air of assurance about him. His expression was haughty, his gait proud. The girl, who was very pretty, was singing. She gazed lovingly at her Theatine and tweaked his podgy cheeks from time to time. "You'll grant me at least," Candide said to Martin, "that those two are happy? So far throughout the inhabited world I've encountered only unfortunates, except in El Dorado, that is. But as for that girl and her Theatine, I bet they're very happy creatures." "I bet they're not," said Martin. "All we have to do is invite them to dinner," said Candide, "and you'll see if I'm wrong." Thereupon he went up to them, presented his compliments, and invited them back to his hostelry for some macaroni, Lombardy partridge and caviar, washed down with Montepulciano, Lacrima Christi, and some of the wines of Cyprus and Samos. The young lady blushed. The Theatine accepted the invitation, and the girl followed him, glancing at Candide with eyes wide in surprise and embarrassment and clouded with tears. Scarcely had she entered Candide's room than she said to him, "Well, doesn't Master Candide recognize Paquette any more?" At these words Candide, who had not looked at her closely until then, because he had thoughts only for Cunegonde, said to her, "Oh dear, my poor girl. So you are the one who got Dr. Pangloss into the fine state I saw him in?" "Alas, sir, I am indeed," said Paquette. "I see you know all about it. I heard about the dreadful misfortunes that befell her ladyship's household and the fair Miss Cunegonde. I swear to you, my own fate has hardly been less wretched. I was utterly innocent when last you saw me. A Franciscan monk who was my confessor had no difficulty in seducing me. The consequences were terrible. I was obliged to leave the castle not long after his lordship kicked you up the backside and sent you packing. If a famous doctor had not taken pity on me, I'd have had it. For a time I became the doctor's mistress, as a way of showing my gratitude. His wife, who was madly jealous, beat me every day without mercy. She was a fury. This doctor was the ugliest of men, and I the unhappiest of creatures, to be continually beaten for a man I did not love. As you know, sir, it's very dangerous for a shrewish woman to have a doctor for a husband. One day, sick and tired of the way his wife was behaving, he treated her for a slight cold by giving her some medicine, which proved so effective that within 2 hours she was dead, having had some horrible convulsions. The mistress's family brought an action against the master. He upped and fled, and I was put in prison. My innocence would not have saved me had I not been reasonably pretty. The judge let me go on condition that he would succeed the doctor. I was soon supplanted by a rival, dismissed without a penny, and obliged to continue in this unspeakable profession, which seems so harmless to you men, and which for us is nothing but a vale of tears. I chose Venice to practice my profession in. Oh, sir, if you could imagine what it's like having to caress just anybody, an old merchant, a lawyer, a monk, a gondolier, an abbé, to be exposed to all manner of insult and degradation, to be reduced often to having to borrow a skirt, only then to go and have it lifted up by some disgusting man or other, to be robbed by one of what one's earned with another, to be held to ransom by officers of the law, and to have nothing to look forward to but a gruesome old age, the workhouse and the rubbish heap. Then you would agree that I am one of the unhappiest and most unfortunate creatures alive." This was how, in a private room in the hostelry, Paquette opened her heart to good Candide in the presence of Martin, who said to Candide, "You see, I've already won half my bet." Brother Giroflée had remained in the dining room, and was having a drink as he waited for dinner. "But," Candide said to Paquette, "you were looking so gay, so happy when I ran into you. You were singing. You were fondling the theatine quite naturally and willingly. You seem to me every bit as happy as you say you are unhappy." "Ah, sir," replied Paquette, "that's another of the awful things about our profession. Yesterday I was robbed and beaten by an officer, and today I have to appear to be in a good mood just to please a monk." That was enough for Candide. He admitted that Martin was right. They sat down to dinner with Paquette and the theatine. The meal was quite good-humoured, and at the end they were all talking to each other with some degree of freedom. "Father," Candide said to the monk, "you seem to me to be enjoying the kind of life everyone must envy. You are the picture of health, you have a happy face, you have a very pretty girl to keep you amused, and you seem perfectly content with your monastic condition." "By my faith, sir," said Brother Giroflée, "I wish all theatines were at the bottom of the sea. I've been tempted 100 times to set fire to the monastery and to go and turn Turk. My parents forced me to don this detestable habit at the age of 15, so that I would leave a bigger fortune for my damned elder brother, may God confound him. The monastery is rife with jealousy and backbiting and bad feeling. It's true that I have preached a few miserable sermons that have brought me in some money, half of which the prior steals, the rest I use for keeping girls. But when I get back to the monastery in the evening, I'm ready to beat my head in on the dormitory walls, and all the brothers feel the same way." Martin turned to Candide with his usual sang-froid. "Well," he said, "have I not won the whole bet?" Candide gave Paquette 2,000 piastres, and Brother Giroflée 1,000. "I guarantee you," he said, "that with this money they'll be happy." "I shouldn't think so for a minute," said Martin. "With these piastres you may make them even more unhappy still." "Whatever shall be, said Candide. "But one thing consoles me. I see that people one never thought to see again often do turn up. It may well turn out that having run into my red sheep and Paquette, I will also run into Cunegonde." "I wish," said Martin, "that she may one day make you happy. But I very much doubt she will." "You are a bit hard," said Candide. "That's because I have lived," said Martin. "But look at those gondoliers," said Candide. "They're always singing, aren't they?" "You don't see them at home with their wives and screaming children," said Martin. "The Doge has his problems, the gondoliers have theirs. It is true that all things considered the life of a gondolier is preferable to that of a doge, but I think there's so little in it that it's not worth arguing about. I've heard people talk, said Candide, about a Senator Pococurante who lives in that beautiful palace on the Brenta, and who's very hospitable to visiting foreigners. They say he's a man who's never had any troubles. I'd like to meet such a rare breed, said Martin. Candide at once sent someone to ask the noble Signor Pococurante's permission to call on him the following day. Chapter 25. The Visit to Signor Pococurante, a Venetian Nobleman. Candide and Martin proceeded down the Brenta by gondola and came to the palace of the noble Pococurante. The gardens were well laid out and embellished with beautiful marble statues, while the palace itself was a fine piece of architecture. The master of the house, a man of 60 and very rich, received the two curious visitors most politely, but with very little fuss, which disconcerted Candide and did not displease Martin. First, two pretty and neatly dressed girls poured out some chocolate, managing to give it a good frothy top. Candide could not help but compliment them on their beauty, their kindness, and their skill. "They're not bad creatures," said Senator Pococurante. "I have them sleep with me sometimes because I'm rather tired of the society ladies here with all their flirting and their jealousy and their quarrelling and their moods and their petty-mindedness and their arrogance and their silliness, not to mention the sonnets you have to compose or have composed for them. But, well, in the end, I'm beginning to find these two girls exceedingly boring too." Candide, walking in a long gallery after lunch, was surprised at the beauty of the paintings. He asked which master had painted the first two. "They're by Raphael," said the senator. "I bought them out of vanity some years ago for a considerable amount of money. They are said to be the finest in Italy, but I don't like them at all. The coloring is very dark. The faces aren't sufficiently rounded and don't stand out enough, and the draperies don't bear the slightest resemblance to any real cloth. Basically, whatever anyone may say, I don't consider that they're a true imitation of nature. You'll only get me to like a picture when I think I'm looking at nature itself. And there aren't any like that. I have lots of paintings, but I don't look at them anymore." As they waited for dinner, Pococurante gave orders for a concerto to be played. Candide found the music delightful. "This sort of noise helps pass the odd half hour," said Pococurante. "But if it goes on any longer, everybody finds it tedious. Though no one dares say so. Nowadays, music is simply nothing more than the art of playing difficult pieces, and that which is merely difficult gives no pleasure in the end. Perhaps I'd prefer opera if they hadn't found a way of turning it into a monstrous hybrid which I find quite repugnant. Let anyone who wishes to go and see bad tragedies set to music, with all those scenes that have been put together simply as pretexts, and pretty poor ones at that, for 2 or 3 ridiculous songs which allow an actress to show off her vocal cords. Let anyone that wants to, and that can, go and swoon away with ecstasy at the sight of a castrato humming the roles of Caesar and Cato and strutting about the stage in that ungainly fashion. For my part, I have long since given up going to these paltry affairs, even though nowadays they are the glory of Italy and put its ruling princes to so much expense." Candide demurred somewhat, though with tact. Martin was entirely of the senator's opinion. They sat down to eat, and after an excellent dinner they went into the library. Candide, on seeing a magnificently bound edition of Homer, complimented his most illustrious host on his good taste. "This book," he said, "used to delight the great Pangloss, the finest philosopher in Germany." "It doesn't delight me," said Pococurante coolly. "They did once have me believe that I took pleasure in reading it, but that endless repetition of combats which all seem the same, those gods who are always doing things but never getting anywhere, that Helen who causes the war and then plays scarcely any part in the thing,
that Troy they besiege and never take. I found all that deadly boring.
I've sometimes asked men of learning if they found reading it as boring as I did. The honest ones admitted that the book used to drop from their hands, but said that you have to have it in your library like an ancient monument, or like those rusty medals that have no commercial value.
Your Excellency doesn't think the same about Virgil, said Candide.
I agree that the 2nd, 4th, and 6th books of the Aeneid are excellent, said Pococurante. But as for his pious Aeneas and valiant Cloanthus and faithful Achates and little Ascanius, not to mention the half-witted King Latinus and parochial Amata and insipid Lavinia, I can think of nothing more disagreeable or more likely to leave one absolutely cold. I prefer Tasso and those improbable tales of Ariosto.
Dare I ask, sir, said Candide, whether Horace does not afford you considerable pleasure?
There are 1 or 2 maxims, said Pococurante, which a man of the world may profit by, and which fix themselves more readily in the memory for being compressed in powerful verse. But I care very little for his journey to Brindisi, or the description of that poor dinner he had, or that foul-mouthed quarrel between someone or other called Pupilus, whose language, he says, was full of pus, and someone else whose language was like vinegar. It was only with extreme distaste that I read his crude verses against old women and witches, and I cannot see what merit there can be in telling his friend Maecenas that if he were to place him among the ranks of the lyric poets, he would bang his sublime forehead on the stars in the heavens. Fools admire everything in a respected author. I read only for myself. I like only what may be of use to me.
Candide, who had been brought up never to judge things for himself, was much astonished by what he heard, and Martin found Pococurante's way of thinking rather sensible.
"Oh, look! Here's a copy of Cicero," said Candide. "I'm sure when it comes to this great man, you never tire of reading him."
"I never read him," replied the Venetian. "What does it matter to me whether he defended Rabirius or Cluentius? What with the cases I try myself, I have quite enough of all that as it is. I might have got on better with his philosophical works, but when I saw that he doubted everything, I decided that I knew as much as he did, and that I didn't need anyone else's help if I was going to be ignorant."
"Ah, look, 80 volumes of the Proceedings of an Academy of Science," exclaimed Martin. "There may be something worthwhile there."
"There would be," said Pococurante, "if but one of the authors of all that rubbish had so much as invented the art of making pins. But in every one of those books there is nothing but pointless theorizing, and not a single thing that's useful."
"What a lot of plays there are," said Candide, "in Italian, in Spanish, in French."
"Yes," said the senator, "there are 3,000 of them, and not 36 good ones. As for the collected sermons, which between them aren't worth 1 page of Seneca, and all those fat tomes on theology, well, you can be sure I never opened them, not I, not anyone."
Martin noticed some shelves full of English books. "I imagine," he said, "that a Republican must find most of these enjoyable to read, given how free the authors were to write them."
"Yes," answered Pococurante, "it is a fine thing to write what one thinks. It is man's privilege. Throughout this Italy of ours, people write only what they do not think. Those who live in the land of the Caesars and the Antonines dare not have an idea without obtaining permission from a Dominican friar. I would be content with the freedom which inspires these English men of genius if their passion for the party interest didn't spoil all the estimable things that would otherwise flow from this precious freedom."
Candide, catching sight of a copy of Milton, asked him if he did not regard this author as a great man.
"Who?" said Pococurante. "That barbarian with his long commentary on the first book of Genesis in 10 books of difficult verse? That crude imitator of the Greeks who gives such a distorted view of the creation, and where Moses shows the eternal being producing the world with his spoken word, has the Messiah take a great big compass out of a tool chest in heaven and start drawing a plan. Me? Admire the man who ruined Tasso's vision of hell and the devil, who has Lucifer appear disguised variously as a toad or a pygmy, who makes him say the same things over and over again, who makes him discuss theological points, who takes Ariosto's bit of comic invention about the firearms seriously, and has the devils firing the cannon into heaven. Neither I nor anyone else in Italy has ever been able to enjoy all these extravagant absurdities. The marriage of sin and death, and the adders to which sin gives birth, are enough to make anyone with a delicate stomach vomit. And his long description of a hospital is fit only for a gravedigger. That obscure, bizarre, disgusting poem was spurned at birth. Now, I treat it the way it was treated in its own time by the readers in its own country. Anyway, I say what I think, and I couldn't care less whether anyone thinks the way I do or not.
Candide was distressed to hear all this. He admired Homer, and he had a sneaking fondness for Milton. "Oh dear," he said to Martin under his breath, "I'm very much afraid that this man may have a sovereign disregard for our German poets." "Well, there would be no great harm in that," said Martin. "Oh, what a great man!" Candide continued to mutter to himself. "What a great genius this Pococurante is! There is no pleasing him." Having thus inspected all the books, they went down into the garden. Candide praised all its finer features. "I know of nothing that could be in worse possible taste," said the master of the house. "All you see here are just pretty bits and pieces. But as from tomorrow, I'm going to have a new one planted along much nobler lines." When the two curious visitors had taken their leave of His Excellency, Candide turned to Martin. "Well, there you are," he said. "You will agree that there is the happiest of men, for he is above all that he owns." "Don't you see," said Martin, "that he's sated on everything he owns? Plato said a long time ago that the best stomachs are not those which reject all foods." "But," said Candide, "isn't there pleasure in criticizing everything, in finding fault where other men think they find beauty?" "Which is to say," rejoined Martin, "that there's pleasure in not having pleasure." "Oh, all right, have it your way then," said Candide. "So the only one who's happy is me, when I see Miss Cunegonde again." "One does well to hope," said Martin. Meanwhile the days, the weeks went by. Still Cacambo did not return, and Candide was so sunk in misery that it did not even occur to him that Paquette and brother Giroflée had not so much as come to thank him. Chapter 26. Of a supper that Candide and Martin ate in the company of 6 strangers, and who they were. One evening as Candide, accompanied by Martin, was about to sit down to table with the other passing strangers staying in the same hostelry, a man with a face the colour of soot came up behind him, and taking him by the arm said, "Be ready to leave when we do, and do not fail." He turned round. It was Cacambo. Only the sight of Cunegonde could have surprised and pleased him more. He went nearly mad with joy. He embraced his dear friend. "Cunegonde must be here then. Where is she? Take me to her. Let me die of joy with her." "Cunegonde is not here," said Cacambo. "She's in Constantinople." "Oh, heavens! In Constantinople? But were she in China, I should fly to her. Let's go." "We will leave after supper," replied Cacambo. "I can't say any more. I'm a slave, and my master waiting for me. I've got to go and wait on him at table. Don't breathe a word. Have supper, and then be ready and waiting." Candide, torn between joy and pain, absolutely delighted to have seen his faithful agent again, surprised to see him now a slave, full of the idea of being reunited with his beloved, his heart in tumult and his mind in a spin, sat down to eat in the company of Martin, who was watching all these goings-on with equanimity, and of the 6 strangers who had come to spend Carnival in Venice. Cacambo, who was filling the glass of one of these strangers, drew near to his master's ear at the end of the meal and said to him, "Sire, your Majesty may depart when he wishes. The ship is ready." Having said this, he left the room. Astonished, the supper guests were exchanging silent glances, when another servant came up to his master and said, "Sire, your Majesty's carriage is at Padua, and the boat is ready." His master made a sign, and the servant left. All the guests stared at each other again, and the general amazement increased. A third servant, coming up to a third stranger, said to him, "Believe me, sire, your Majesty must not stay here a moment longer. I shall go and get everything ready." And he disappeared at once. Candide and Martin now had no doubt that this was some masquerade to do with the carnival. A fourth servant said to a fourth master, "Your Majesty may depart at his convenience," and left the room like the others. The fifth servant said the same to the fifth master, but the sixth servant spoke differently to the sixth stranger, who was sitting next to Candide. He said to him, "Lord me, sire, they're refusing to let your Majesty have any more credit, nor me neither, and the pair of us will be like carted off to clink this very night. I'm off to look after number one, thank you very much. Goodbye." The servants having all vanished, the six strangers, Candide and Martin, remained deep in silence. Finally, Candide broke it. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is some strange joke. How is it that you are all kings? For my part, I must tell you that neither I nor Martin are anything of the sort." Cacambo's master then intervened gravely and said in Italian, "I am no joke. My name is Ahmed III. I was Grand Sultan for several years. I dethroned my brother. My nephew has dethroned me. My viziers have had their heads cut off. I am spending the rest of my days in the old Seraglio. My nephew, the Grand Sultan Mahmoud, occasionally allows me to travel for my health, and I have come to spend Carnival in Venice." A young man who was next to Ahmed spoke after him and said, "My name is Ivan. I was emperor of all the Russias. I was dethroned in my cradle. My father and mother were locked up. I was brought up in prison. I occasionally get permission to travel, accompanied by my guards, and I have come to spend Carnival in Venice." The third said, "I am Charles Edward, King of England. My father renounced his claim to the throne in my favour. I fought many battles to make good my claim. 800 of my supporters had their hearts ripped out and their cheeks slapped with them. I was put in prison. I'm on my way to Rome to visit my father, the king, dethroned like me and my grandfather, and I've come to spend Carnival in Venice." The fourth then spoke up and said, "I am the King of Poland. The fortunes of war have dispossessed me of my ancestral domains. My father suffered the same reverses. I am resigned to Providence like Sultan Ahmed, Emperor Ivan, and King Charles Edward, whom God preserve, and I have come to spend Carnival in Venice." The fifth said, "I too am the King of Poland. I have lost my kingdom twice, but Providence has given me another domain, in which I have done more good than all the kings of Sarmatia put together have ever been able to manage on the banks of the Vistula. I too am resigned to Providence, and I have come to spend Carnival in Venice." It remained for the sixth monarch to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, "I am not so great a lord as any of you, but, well, I have been a king just like everyone else. I am Theodore. I was elected king in Corsica. They call me Your Majesty, and now they hardly call me Sir. Once I minted money, and now I haven't a penny. Once I had 2 secretaries of state, and now I have scarcely a valet. I once sat on a throne, and I have spent a long time in prison in London with straw for a bed. I am much afraid I shall be treated in the same way here, although I came, like Your Majesties, to spend Carnival in Venice." The other 5 kings listened to this speech with a noble compassion. Each of them gave King Theodore 20 sequins to buy coats and shirts, and Candide made him a present of a diamond worth 2,000 sequins. "Who can this be, then?" said the 5 kings. "A mere private individual who's in a position to give 100 times as much as each of us, and who gives it?" Just as they were leaving the table, there arrived in the same hostelry 4 serene highnesses who had also lost their domains through the fortunes of war, and who were coming to spend what was left of the carnival in Venice. But Candide did not even notice these new arrivals. All he could think about was going to find his dear Cunegonde in Constantinople. Chapter 27. Candide's Journey to Constantinople. Faithful Cacambo had already obtained permission from the Turkish captain who was to take Sultan Ahmed back to Constantinople for Candide and Martin to join them on board. Together they made their way to the ship, having prostrated themselves before his unhappy highness. On the way, Candide was saying to Martin, "There you are, you see. That was 6 dethroned kings we had supper with. And that's not all. Among those 6 kings, there was one I could give alms to. Perhaps there are lots more princes who are even more unfortunate. Whereas me, all I've lost is 100 sheep, and I'm flying to the arms of Cunegonde. My dear Martin, once more Pangloss was right. All is well." "I certainly hope so," said Martin. "But," said Candide, "that was a pretty unlikely adventure we had in Venice. Whoever saw or heard tell of 6 dethroned kings having supper together in a tavern?" "It's no more extraordinary," said Martin, "than most of the things that have happened to us. It's very common for kings to be dethroned, and as for the honour of having supper with them, there's nothing special about that." Scarce was Candide aboard than he fell upon the neck of his former manservant, his friend Cacambo. "Well then," said Candide, "what's Cunegonde doing? Is she still a paragon of beauty? Does she still love me? How is she? Presumably you bought her a palace in Constantinople."
"My dear master," replied Cacambo, "Cunegonde is washing dishes on the shore of the Sea of Marmara for a prince who has very few dishes. She's a slave in the household of an ex-ruler called Ragotsky, to whom in his exile the Grand Turk gives 3 crowns a day. But worse than that, she has lost her beauty and become horribly ugly."
"Oh, beautiful or ugly," said Candide, "I'm a man of honour, and my duty is to love her always. But how can she possibly have fallen so low with the 5 or 6 millions you took her?"
"Look here," said Cacambo. "Didn't I have to give 2 million to Senor Don Fernando de Barra y Figueroa y Mascarenes y Alamportas y Susa, governor of Buenos Aires, for permission to take Miss Cunegonde back? And didn't the pirate very kindly relieve us of the rest? And didn't the same pirate take us to keep Matapan, Milo, Nicaria, Samos, Petra, the Dardanelles, Marmara, and Scutari? Cunegonde and the old woman are now working as servants to the prince I told you about, and I am a slave of the dethroned sultan."
"What a chain of appalling calamities, one after another," said Candide. "But after all, I do still have some diamonds left. I will easily secure Cunegonde's release. It really is a pity that she's become so ugly." Then, turning to Martin, "Who do you think one should feel most sorry for?" he said. "Emperor Ahmed, Emperor Ivan, King Charles Edward, or me?"
"I've no idea," said Martin. "I'd have to see inside all your hearts to know the answer to that."
"Ah," said Candide, "if Pangloss were here, he would know. He would tell us the answer."
"I don't know what sort of scales your Pangloss could have used to weigh the misfortunes of men and calculate their sufferings," said Martin. "All I presume is that there are millions of people on this earth one might feel 100 times sorrier for than King Charles Edward, Emperor Ivan, and Sultan Ahmed."
"That may well be so," said Candide. In a few days, they reached the channel leading to the Black Sea. The first thing Candide did was to buy Cacambo back at a very high price, and then without delay he and his companions quickly boarded a galley and made for the shores of the Sea of Marmara in search of Cunegonde, ugly though she might be. Amongst the galley slaves were 2 prisoners who rowed extremely badly, and to whose naked shoulders the Levantine captain would periodically apply a few lashes of his bull's pizzle. Candide's natural reaction was to pay more attention to them than to the other galley slaves, and he drew near them with compassion. 1 or 2 features on their disfigured faces seemed to him to bear some resemblance to those of Pangloss, and that unfortunate Jesuit, Miss Cunegonde's brother, the Baron. The thought touched and saddened him. He watched them even more closely. "Quite honestly," he said to Cacambo, "if I hadn't seen Maître Pangloss hanged, and if I hadn't had the misfortune to kill the Baron, I could swear it was them rowing on this galley." On hearing the names of the Baron and Pangloss, the two galley slaves gave a great shout, stopped still on their bench and dropped their oars. The Levantine captain rushed up to them, and the lashes from his bull's pizzle rained down anew. "Stop, stop, good sir!" screamed Candide. "I will give you all the money you want."
"Why, it's Candide," said one of the two galley slaves.
"Why, it's Candide," said the other. "Am I dreaming all this?" said Candide. "Am I awake? Am I really here on this galley? Is that the Baron I killed? Is that the Maître Pangloss I saw hanged?" "It is we," they replied.
"What? So that's the great philosopher," said Martin.
"Look here, Mr. Levantine captain," said Candide. "How much ransom do you want for Mr. von Thunder ten Tronckh, one of the foremost barons of the empire, and for Mr. Pangloss, the profoundest metaphysician in Germany?"
"You Christian cur," replied the Levantine slave driver. "Since these two Christian slave dogs are barons and metaphysicians, which is no doubt a great honour where they come from, you can give me 50,000 sequins."
"You shall have them, sir. Get me to Constantinople as fast as you possibly can, and you will be paid on the spot. Oh, on second thoughts, take me to Miss Cunegonde."
The Levantine captain, at Candide's first offer, had already altered course for the city, and he bid the crew row faster than a bird may cleave the air.
Candide embraced the Baron and Pangloss 100 times. "And how did I not kill you, my dear Baron? And you, my dear Pangloss, how is it that you are alive after being hanged? And what are you both doing on a galley in Turkey?"
"Is it really true that my dear sister is here in this country?" said the Baron. "Yes," replied Cacambo. "So here is my dear Candide again," exclaimed Pangloss.
Candide introduced them to Martin and Cacambo. They all embraced. Everyone talked at once. The galley was flying along. They were already in port. A Jew was summoned, to whom Candide sold a diamond worth 100,000 sequins for 50,000, and who swore by Abraham that he could not offer a sequin more. Thereupon Candide paid the ransom for the Baron and Pangloss. The latter threw himself at the feet of his liberator and bathed them in tears. The other thanked him with a nod of his head, and promised to reimburse him at the earliest opportunity.
"But can it really be that my sister is in Turkey?" he said. "It really can," retorted Cacambo, "seeing as how she's washing dishes for a prince of Transylvania."
At once 2 Jews were sent for. Candide sold some more diamonds, and they all left by another galley to go and deliver Cunegonde from bondage. Chapter 28. What happened to Candide, Cunegonde, Pangloss, Martin and co. "Once more forgive me," Candide said to the Baron. "Forgive me, Reverend Father, for running you through with my sword like that." "We'll say no more about it," said the Baron. "I did speak rather sharply, I admit. But since you want to know how you came to find me on a galley, I will tell you that after being cured of my wounds by the college's apothecary monk, I was set upon and abducted by a group of Spaniards. I was put in prison in Buenos Aires just after my sister left there. I asked to be allowed to return to Rome to be with the Father General. I was appointed almoner to His Excellency the Ambassador of France in Constantinople. I hadn't been in the post more than a week when one evening I ran into a young Ikaglan, who was very good-looking. It was extremely hot. The young man wanted to go for a swim. I took the opportunity to go swimming too. I did not know that it was a capital offence for a Christian to be found stark naked with a young Muslim. A Cadi had me birched 100 times on the soles of the feet and sent me to the galleys. I don't believe there's ever been a more ghastly miscarriage of justice. But what I'd like to know is why my sister is working in the kitchens of a Transylvanian ruler in exile among the Turks. But you, my dear Pangloss, said Candide, how is it that we meet again?
It is true that you did see me hanged, said Pangloss. I was, of course, to have been burned, but as you will remember, it poured with rain just as they were about to roast me.
The storm was so violent that they gave up trying to light the fire, and I was hanged for want of a better alternative. A surgeon bought my body, took me home with him, and dissected me. First, he made a cruciform incision in me from my navel to my collarbone. One can't have had a worse hanging than I'd had. The executive arm of the high works of the Holy Inquisition, namely a sub-deacon, certainly did a splendid job when it came to burning people, but he wasn't used to hanging. The rope was wet and wouldn't slip through properly, and it got caught, so I was still breathing. The crucial incision made me give such an enormous shriek that my surgeon fell over backwards, and thinking it was the devil himself he was dissecting, rushed away, nearly dying of fright, and then, to cap it all, fell down the stairs in his flight. His wife came running from the next room at the noise, saw me stretched out on the table with my crucial incision, took even greater fright than her husband, fled, and fell over him. When they'd collected their wits a little, I heard the surgeon's wife say to her husband, "My dear, what on earth were you thinking of, dissecting a heretic like that? Don't you know that those sort of people always have the devil in them? I'm going to fetch a priest this minute to exorcise him." I shuddered to hear this, and I mustered what little strength I had left and cried out, "Have mercy on me!" In the end, the Portuguese barber plucked up courage. He sewed me up again, and his wife even nursed me. I was up and about again in a fortnight. The barber found me a position and made me lackey to a knight of Malta who was going to Venice, but since my master had not the means to pay me, I entered service with a merchant of Venice and followed him to Constantinople. One day I happened to enter a mosque. There was no one in there apart from an old imam and a very pretty young worshipper who was saying her paternosters. Her bosom was uncovered for all to see, and in her cleavage was a lovely posy of tulips, roses, anemones, buttercups, hyacinths, and auriculas. She dropped her posy. I picked it up and replaced it for her with respectful zeal. I took so long about replacing it that the imam became angry, and seeing I was a Christian, called for help. I was taken to the Cadi, who sentenced me to 100 strokes of the lash on the soles of my feet, and sent me to the galleys. I was chained up in precisely the same galley and on precisely the same bench as his lordship the Baron. On the galley were 4 young men from Marseille, 5 Neapolitan priests, and 2 monks from Corfu, who all told us this sort of thing happened every day. His lordship claimed he'd been more unjustly treated than I had. I maintained, for my part, that it was much more permissible putting a posy back on a woman's bosom than being stark naked with an eicheglan. We used to argue the whole time, and were getting 20 lashes a day with the bull's pizzle when, by a turn in the chain of events that governs this universe, you were led to our galley and brought us back. "Now then, my dear Pangloss," Candide said to him, "when you were being hanged and dissected and beaten and made to row in a galley, did you continue to think that things were turning out for the best?" "I still feel now as I did at the outset," replied Pangloss. "I am a philosopher, after all. It wouldn't do for me to go back on what I said before. What with Leibniz not being able to be wrong and pre-established harmony being the finest thing in the world, not to mention the plenum and materia subtilis." Chapter 29. How Candide was reunited with Cunegonde and the old woman. While Candide, the Baron, Pangloss, Martin, and Cacambo were recounting their adventures, and philosophizing about which events in the universe are contingent and which not contingent, and arguing about effects and causes, moral and physical evil, freedom and necessity, and about what consolations are to be had on board a Turkish galley, they landed on the shores of the Sea of Marmara at the house of the Prince of Transylvania. The first thing they saw was Cunegonde and the old woman hanging towels out on a line to dry. The Baron went pale at the sight. Candide, the tender-hearted lover, on seeing his fair Cunegonde all brown, with her eyes bloodshot, her bosom shriveled, her cheeks wrinkled and her arms red and peeling, recoiled 3 paces in horror, and then went forward out of sheer good manners. She embraced Candide and her brother. They embraced the old woman. Candide bought them both free. There was a small farm in the vicinity. The old woman suggested to Candide that it would do them nicely while they waited for the whole company to fall on better times. Cunegonde did not know that she had become ugly. No one had told her. She reminded Candide of his promises in such a firm tone that good Candide did not dare refuse her. He intimated to the Baron, therefore, that he was going to marry his sister. "I will not tolerate such a demeaning act on her part," he said, "nor such insolence from you. Never shall it be said that I allowed such infamy. My wife's children would never be able to mix in Germany's noble chapters. No, my sister will marry no one but a baron of the empire." Cunegonde threw herself at his feet and bathed them with her tears. He was inflexible. "You great numbskull," said Candide. "I've saved you from the galleys, I've paid your ransom, and I've paid your sister's. She was washing dishes here. She's ugly. I have the goodness to make her my wife, and you still think you're going to stand in our way. I'd kill you all over again if I let my anger have its way." "You can kill me all over again if you want," said the Baron, "but you won't marry my sister so long as I live." Chapter 30. Conclusion. Candide, in his heart of hearts, had no desire to marry Cunegonde, but the extreme impertinence of the Baron made him decide to go through with the marriage, and Cunegonde was pressing him so keenly that he could not go back on his word. He consulted Pangloss, Martin, and the faithful Cacambo. Pangloss wrote a fine dissertation in which he proved that the Baron had no rights over his sister, and that it was open to her, under all the laws of the empire, to marry Candide with the left hand. Martin was for throwing the Baron into the sea. Cacambo decided they should return him to the Levantine captain and have him put back in the galleys, after which he was to be packed off to the Father General in Rome on the first available ship. This view of the matter was thought to be very sound. The old woman approved. Nothing was said to his sister. The thing was done with the help of a little money, and they had the pleasure of bettering a Jesuit and punishing the arrogance of a German baron. It was quite natural to imagine that after so many disasters, Candide, now married to his sweetheart and living with the philosophical Pangloss, the philosophical Martin, the prudent Cacambo, and the old woman, and, moreover, having brought back so many diamonds from the land of the ancient Incas, would be leading the most agreeable of all possible lives. But he was swindled so many times by the Jews that all he had left in the end was his little farm. His wife, who grew uglier with every day that passed, became shrewish and impossible to live with. The old woman was infirm and even more bad-tempered than Cunegonde. Cacambo, who worked in the garden and travelled to Constantinople to sell vegetables, was worn out with work and cursed his fate. Pangloss was in despair at not being a luminary in some German university. As for Martin, he was firmly persuaded that one is just as badly off wherever one is. He put up with things as they were. Candide, Martin, and Pangloss would argue sometimes about metaphysics and ethics. They would often see boats passing beneath the windows of the farmhouse, laden with Effendis, Pashas, and Cadis, who were being exiled to Lemnos or Mytilene or Erzurum. They would see more Cadis, more Pashas, and more Effendis coming to take the place of those who had been expelled, and being themselves in their turn expelled. They would see heads duly stuffed with straw being taken for display before the Sublime Porte. Such sights would give rise to yet further disquisitions, and when they were not arguing, the boredom was so excessive that the old woman made bold to say to them one day, "I would like to know which is worse, being raped 100 times by Negro pirates, having a buttock chopped off, running the gauntlet of the Bulgars, being flogged and hanged in an auto da fe, being dissected, rowing in a galley, in short, suffering all the misfortunes we've suffered, or simply being stuck here, doing nothing?" "That is a good question," said Candide. This speech gave rise to renewed speculation, and Martin in particular came to the conclusion that man was born to spend his life alternately a prey to the throes of anxiety and the lethargy of boredom. Candide did not agree, but asserted nothing. Pangloss admitted that he had always suffered horribly, But having once maintained that everything was going marvellously, he still maintained it, and believed nothing of the sort. One thing finally confirmed Martin in his detestable principles, gave Candide more than ever pause, and embarrassed Pangloss. This was the sight one day of Paquette and brother Giroflée arriving at their farm in a state of extreme wretchedness. They had very quickly gone through their 3,000 piastres, left each other, patched things up, quarrelled again, been put in prison, escaped, and in the end, brother Giroflée had turned Turk. Paquette still pursued her profession, and no longer earned any money at it. "I told you so," Martin said to Candide. "I knew what you gave them would soon be gone, and would only make them even more wretched. You had more piastres than you knew what to do with, you and Cacambo, and you are no happier than brother Giroflée and Paquette." "Aha!" said Pangloss to Paquette. "So heaven brings you back here among us, my poor child. Do you know, you've cost me the tip of my nose, an eye and an ear? And you! Just look at the state you're in. What a world we live in." This new turn of events led them to philosophize more than ever. There lived in the neighbourhood a very famous dervish who passed for the greatest philosopher in Turkey. They went to consult him. Pangloss acted as their spokesman and said to him, "Master, we have come to ask you to tell us why such a strange animal as man was created." "What's that to you?" said the dervish. "Is it any of your business?" "But, Reverend Father," said Candide, "there's an awful lot of evil in the world." "What does it matter whether there's evil or there's good?" said the dervish. "When His Highness sends a ship to Egypt, does he worry whether the mice on board are comfortable or not?" "So what must we do then?" said Pangloss. "Be silent," said the dervish. "I had flattered myself," said Pangloss, "that we might have a talk about effects and causes, the best of all possible worlds, the origin of evil, the nature of the soul, and pre-established harmony." The dervish, at these words, slammed the door in their faces. During this conversation, news had spread that 2 viziers of the bench and the mufti had been strangled in Constantinople, and several of their friends impaled. This catastrophe made a great stir everywhere for some hours. On their way back to the farm, Pangloss, Candide and Martin met a kindly old man who was taking the air at his door beneath an arbour of orange trees. Pangloss, who was as curious as he was prone to philosophizing, asked him the name of the mufti who had just been strangled. "I have no idea," replied the fellow, "and I never have known what any mufti or vizier was called. What you have just told me means absolutely nothing to me. I have no doubt that in general those who get involved in public affairs do sometimes come to a sad end, and that they deserve it. But I never inquire what's going on in Constantinople. I'm content to send my fruit for sale there from the garden I cultivate." Having said this, he invited the strangers into his house. His 2 daughters and 2 sons offered them several kinds of sorbet, which they made themselves, some kaimak sharpened with the zest of candied citron, some oranges, lemons, limes, pineapple and pistachio nuts, and some mocha coffee which had not been blended with that awful coffee from Batavia and the islands. After which the 2 daughters of this good Muslim perfumed the beards of Candide, Pangloss and Martin. "You must have a vast and magnificent property," said Candide to the Turk. "I have but 20 acres," replied the Turk. "I cultivate them with my children. Work keeps us from 3 great evils, boredom, vice, and need." Candide, on his way back to his farm, thought long and hard about what the Turk had said, and commented to Pangloss and Martin. "That kind old man seems to me to have made a life for himself, which is much preferable to that of those 6 kings with whom we had the honour of having supper." "High rank can be very dangerous," said Pangloss. "All the philosophers say so, for the fact is, Eglon, king of the Moabites, was slain by Ehud. Absalom was hanged by the hair on his head and had 3 darts thrust through his heart. King Nadab, son of Jeroboam, was smitten by Baasha. King Elah by Zimri, Joram by Jehu, Athaliah by Jehoiada, and Kings Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah entered into captivity. You know what sort of deaths befell Croesus, Astyages, Darius, Dionysius of Syracuse, Pyrrhus, Perseus, Hannibal, Jugurtha, Ariovistus, Caesar, Pompey, Nero, Otho, Vitellius, Domitian, Richard II of England, Edward II, Henry VI, Richard III, Mary Stuart, Charles I, Francis III Henrys, and the Emperor Henry IV. You know, I also know, said Candide, that we must cultivate our garden. You're right, said Pangloss, for when man was placed in the Garden of Eden, he was placed there ut operaretur eum, that he might work, which proves that man was not born to rest. Let's get down to work and stop all this philosophizing, said Martin. It's the only way to make life bearable. The little society all fell in with this laudable plan. Each began to exercise his talents. Their small amount of land produced a great deal. Cunegonde was in truth very ugly, but she became an excellent pastry cook. Paquette embroidered. The old woman took care of the linen. Everyone made himself useful, including Brother Giroflée. He was a very fine carpenter, and even became quite the gentleman. And sometimes Pangloss would say to Candide, "All events form a chain in the best of all possible worlds. For in the end, if you had not been given a good kick up the backside and chased out of a beautiful castle for loving Miss Cunegonde, and if you hadn't been subjected to the Inquisition, and if you hadn't wandered about America on foot, and if you hadn't dealt the Baron a good blow with your sword, and if you hadn't lost all your sheep from that fine country of El Dorado, you wouldn't be here now, eating candied citron and pistachio nuts." "That is well put," replied Candide, "but we must cultivate our garden."